Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most deliciously subversive stories you've never heard. How Soviet housewives turned a simple bowl of beet soup into the backbone of an underground economy that would make modern cryptocurrency traders weep with envy. Picture this. It's 1965. You're standing in a cramped Moscow communal kitchen at 5 a.m., watching Valentina Petrovna carefully ladle deep crimson borscht into mason jars while her neighbor keeps watch for informants. The steam rises from the pot like incense in a cathedral of rebellion, and you're about to witness how these women didn't just feed their families. They fed an entire shadow economy that the mighty Soviet state couldn't crush. You probably won't survive this story without craving borscht, fair warning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, or maybe what historical rabbit hole you'd like me to tumble down next. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're about to discover how ordinary Soviet women, armed with nothing but beetroots, cabbage, and an unshakable determination to survive, created an economic system so sophisticated it would make Wall Street traders tip their hats in respect. This isn't just a story about soup, it's about how desperation breeds innovation, how community trumps control, and how sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in the streets, but in the kitchen. The year is 1962, and you're living through what Soviet newspapers politely call temporary supply difficulties, but what everyone else knows as the Great Bread Shortage Crisis. Khrushchev's agricultural reforms have backfired spectacularly, and store shelves across the USSR look like they've been hit by locusts. You queue for hours only to find empty displays where bread should be, and the few loaves available crumble like chalk in your hands. But here's where it gets interesting. While men stand helplessly in those endless lines, women are already plotting something revolutionary in their kitchens. You see, Soviet ideology had painted women as equals in the workforce, but reality kept them chained to domestic duties anyway. Most women worked full-time jobs in factories or offices, then rushed home to cook, clean, and manage households with whatever scraps the state-controlled economy provided. They were expected to be both productive comrades and perfect homemakers, a double burden that would crush lesser spirits. But these women, they turned that burden into opportunity. Meet Klavdia Sergeevna, a textile worker from Leningrad who would become one of the founding mothers of the borscht economy. By day, she operated industrial looms in a stuffy factory, earning 120 rubles a month, barely enough to feed her family of 5. By evening, she transformed into something the state never intended, an entrepreneur. In her communal apartment's tiny kitchen, she began what would become the most successful underground food network in Soviet history. The genius lay in choosing borscht as the foundation. Think about it. This wasn't caviar or champagne that screamed luxury and attracted unwanted attention. Borscht was peasant food, worker food, the kind of humble soup that even the most suspicious party official couldn't fault you for making. It was hiding in plain sight, revolutionary camouflage at its finest. You could simmer a pot of borscht and nobody questioned whether you were feeding your family or fueling a black market empire. But Klavdia understood something crucial that would separate her from amateur profiteers. Quality matters, even in rebellion. While state canteens served watery soup that tasted like boiled sadness, she sourced the best ingredients she could find. Fresh dill smuggled from countryside relatives, real sour cream traded for cigarettes, beef bones bartered from butchers who owed her favors. Her borscht didn't just fill stomachs, it restored souls. The transformation began slowly. Neighbors started asking if they could buy portions when the aroma drifted through the communal corridors. A bowl here, a jar there, always with the excuse that someone was too busy or too sick to cook. Klavdia charged modestly at first, maybe 5 rubles for a liter, claiming she just needed to cover ingredients. But word spread through the whisper networks that connect all desperate people, and soon she was cooking not just for her building, but for friends of friends across the city. Historians still argue whether these women consciously set out to create an alternative economy or simply stumbled into entrepreneurship through necessity. What's certain is that by 1963, Klavdia was earning more from her evening soup operation than her daytime factory job. She wasn't alone. Across Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, and countless smaller cities, women were discovering that their kitchens could be more profitable than their official careers. The timing was perfect, if you can call desperation perfect. The Soviet system had created a generation of people who understood scarcity intimately but had never lost their taste for abundance. They remembered how food should taste, how meals should satisfy, how cooking could be an act of love rather than mere survival. These women weren't trying to overthrow communism, they were trying to make it bearable. You have to admire the audacity. Here were housewives taking one of the most monitored, controlled, surveilled societies in human history and carving out spaces of freedom one soup bowl at a time. They were creating capitalism in the heart of communism, and they were doing it with vegetables. The beauty of the Borscht revolution was its scalability. Unlike other black market goods that required connections to criminals or corrupt officials, anyone with basic cooking skills could enter this economy. A grandmother could make a few extra rubles selling soup to busy working mothers. A young wife could supplement her husband's income without him losing face. Even teenagers could participate by delivering orders or gathering ingredients. By 1964, what started as Klavdia's small kitchen operation had evolved into something approaching a parallel food system. Women weren't just cooking for profit, they were creating economic independence in a society designed to make them dependent. And the most delicious irony? They were using the state's own propaganda about communal cooperation and mutual aid to justify their thoroughly capitalist enterprise. The revolution had begun, simmering quietly in 1,000 communal kitchens, and the Soviet state had no idea what was cooking. You're about to witness the birth of the most sophisticated vegetable smuggling operation in communist history, and it all started with a single frustrated housewife staring at a display case full of nothing but dust and broken dreams. The year is 1963, and you're standing beside Raisa Mikhailovna in a Moscow grocery store that looks like it's been ransacked by particularly picky burglars. The meat counter holds 3 lonely chicken necks, the produce section features wilted cabbage leaves that wouldn't feed a rabbit, and the dairy case contains exactly 1 container of something that might have been sour cream in a previous life. But Raisa isn't just any housewife. She's a woman with a plan and connections that stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You watch as she surveys the pathetic offerings with the calculating gaze of a general planning a campaign. This isn't shopping, it's intelligence gathering. She's about to create a supply network that would make modern logistics companies weep with envy, all centered around getting the right vegetables to the right kitchens at the right time. The genius of the beet underground wasn't just in cooking, it was in sourcing. Remember, the Soviet system was designed to control every aspect of food production and distribution. Collective farms shipped their harvests to state distribution centers, which then allocated supplies to regional stores according to bureaucratic formulas that bore no resemblance to actual demand. The result was a system where Georgia might be drowning in tomatoes while Moscow couldn't find a decent beet to save its life. Raisa had spent 20 years as a railway clerk, processing cargo manifests and freight schedules. She knew which trains carried what produce when they arrived, and, most importantly, which ones carried more than their official paperwork claimed. Soviet agricultural statistics were creative fiction, and she had learned to read between the lines of every shipping document that crossed her desk. You see her making her first contact with Victor, a train conductor who supplemented his income by losing small portions of agricultural shipments. Nothing dramatic, a few crates of potatoes here, a sack of onions there, always small enough to blame on paperwork errors or spoilage. Victor wasn't political, he was practical. His mother-in-law made the best borscht in Tula, and he could sell her surplus to urban customers who paid triple what the state stores charged. The network grew organically, like a living thing adapting to its environment. Raisa connected Victor with Ludmila, a cafeteria worker who had access to institutional-grade vegetables but couldn't feed her own family properly on her wages. Ludmila introduced them to Sergei, a truck driver who hauled produce from collective farms and knew which ones had surplus they needed to move quickly before it spoiled. Within 6 months, you're watching an operation that would make the CIA jealous. Raisa had created a communication system using coded grocery lists passed between trusted women. Need ingredients for grandmother's recipe meant she was ready to buy premium vegetables. Making soup for church fundraiser indicated she needed large quantities. Doctor says I need more iron was code for requesting the darkest, richest beets available. The beauty was in the mundane nature of it all. Who suspects a middle-aged woman carrying a shopping bag full of vegetables? Soviet surveillance was designed to catch political dissidents and foreign spies, not housewives trading carrots. The KGB had infiltrated universities, factories, and intellectual circles, but they hadn't figured out that the real economic revolution was happening in grocery store parking lots. Historians still argue whether the vegetable shortage was intentional policy or bureaucratic incompetence, but the women creating these networks didn't care about the cause. They cared about the solution. They were building parallel distribution systems that actually worked, unlike the official ones that left store shelves empty while produce rotted in distant warehouses. You follow Raisa on her weekly rounds, watching her operate with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Tuesday mornings she meets with the train conductor at the depot, reviewing what's coming in from Ukraine and Belarus. Wednesday afternoons she conferences with 3 other neighborhood organizers, coordinating orders and avoiding oversupply. Thursday evenings she personally inspects every vegetable that enters her network, rejecting anything that won't make premium borscht. The quality control was crucial. These women weren't just selling vegetables, they were selling trust. In a society where official channels constantly disappointed, where promises meant nothing and quality was optional, the Beet Underground delivered exactly what they promised, when they promised it. A housewife who ordered 10 pounds of fresh beets got 10 pounds of fresh beets, not 9 pounds of questionable roots, and an explanation about supply difficulty. The operation required genuine logistical genius. Raisa had to coordinate seasonal availability with customer demand, balance inventory with storage limitations, and manage a workforce of part-time smugglers who were all risking their official jobs to participate. She created a pricing system that accounted for quality, scarcity, and risk, essentially building a free market pricing mechanism inside a command economy. By 1964, the network had expanded beyond Moscow to include suppliers in 5 different Soviet republics. Ukrainian farmers sent the sweetest beets, Georgian connections provided the best herbs, and Siberian contacts somehow managed to smuggle premium root vegetables despite transportation challenges that would defeat modern Amazon logistics. The women had created their own version of international trade, using the same rail and truck networks the state used, but with better results. The most remarkable aspect was how they handled law enforcement. Rather than avoiding officials, they co-opted them. Raisa discovered that police officers' wives also needed quality vegetables, and judges' mothers also made borscht. Soon, the network included customers from every level of Soviet society, creating a protection system based on mutual benefit rather than corruption. You watch as Raisa explains her philosophy to a new recruit. We're not stealing from the state, we're saving vegetables from waste. We're not profiteering, we're providing a service the state can't. We're not criminals, we're Soviet citizens helping other Soviet citizens eat better. It was revolutionary thinking disguised as housewife practicality. The network had become so sophisticated that they developed their own seasonal planning. Spring meant coordinating with greenhouse operators for early vegetables. Summer required managing relationships with collective farm workers who could provide surplus harvest. Fall involved massive preservation operations to maintain supply through winter. Winter meant carefully managing stored inventory while preparing for the next year's growing season. What had started as one woman's frustration with empty store shelves had evolved into an underground economy that served thousands of families across multiple Soviet republics. The Beet Underground wasn't just supplying vegetables, it was supplying hope, proving that citizens could create solutions when the state failed to provide them. And this was just the beginning. The vegetables were flowing, the networks were established, and the women were ready to transform their humble ingredients into something that would challenge the very foundations of Soviet economic control. You're about to discover how a simple recipe card became more valuable than a Communist Party membership, and frankly, a lot more useful for daily survival. It's 1965, and you're sitting in Elena Vasilyevna's kitchen, watching her carefully transcribe what looks like an ordinary borscht recipe onto a piece of paper torn from her daughter's school notebook. But look closer, those aren't just cooking instructions. Those innocent-looking measurements and ingredient lists are actually a sophisticated code system that would make World War II cryptographers tip their hats in admiration. 2 cups of fresh beets, finely diced, Elena writes, but you're learning that this really means I can supply premium root vegetables at 15 rubles per kilogram. When she adds season with salt to taste, she's actually indicating her willingness to accept payment in Western cigarettes or foreign currency. The recipe that appears to be passed down from babushka to granddaughter is actually a business proposal disguised as culinary tradition. The genius wasn't just in the coding, it was in choosing recipes as the medium. Think about it. In a society where owning foreign books could land you in prison, where private business discussions were considered treasonous, and where economic planning was supposed to be handled exclusively by the state, what could be more innocent than sharing grandmother's soup recipe? Even the most paranoid KGB agent couldn't arrest someone for preserving culinary heritage. Elena had developed this system after a close call the previous winter. She'd been discussing prices openly with another housewife in a bread line when she noticed a man in a brown coat taking notes behind them. Whether he was actually an informant or just someone making a shopping list, she realized she needed a safer way to communicate with her growing network of customers and suppliers. The recipe code evolved into something beautifully complex. Different soup types indicated different services. Borscht meant vegetable supply, Solyanka suggested meat connections, and Shkai indicated dairy products. Cooking methods conveyed pricing information. Simmer gently meant premium prices for quality goods, while boil vigorously indicated quick turnover at competitive rates. Even cooking times had meaning. Cook for 30 minutes meant a 30-day payment plan was available. You watch Elena teach the system to new network members, using actual cooking lessons as cover. She'd invite women over for an afternoon of recipe sharing, genuinely teaching them to make better borscht while simultaneously training them in economic espionage. The beauty was that participants really did learn valuable cooking skills alongside the business codes, making the cover story completely authentic. Historians still argue whether these codes were consciously developed or evolved naturally from necessity, but the evidence suggests Elena and women like her were far more sophisticated than anyone realized. They understood that survival in the Soviet system required speaking two languages, the official one for public consumption, and the real one for getting things done. The recipe networks spread faster than gossip in a communal apartment. Women would share family recipes at work, in lines at their children's schools, anywhere Soviet citizens gathered. A teacher might casually mention her grandmother's borscht technique to colleagues, actually advertising her after-school tutoring services paid for with premium ingredients. A factory worker could discuss soup seasoning with her shift partners, really negotiating piecework rates for industrial supplies diverted to the Food Network. The system became so sophisticated that regional variations developed. Moscow recipes tended to be more elaborate, reflecting the capital's access to diverse ingredients and wealthier customers. Leningrad codes were more nautical. Add bay leaves meant connections to Baltic smuggling operations. Ukrainian recipes emphasized sweetness, indicating the sugar and honey trade that flourished near the Romanian border. Elena's masterstroke was creating recipe exchanges that functioned like commodity markets. Women would gather monthly at cooking clubs, hosted in rotating apartments, ostensibly to share family recipes but actually to negotiate prices, discuss supply issues, and coordinate seasonal planning. These meetings looked like innocent social gatherings to any observer, but they were actually board meetings for an underground economy worth millions of rubles. The recipe cards themselves became currency. A handwritten card with a proven profitable coding system could be traded for goods, services, or information. Elena's original borscht code was copied and adapted dozens of times, creating franchises across the Soviet Union. Women in Tashkent were using variations of her system to coordinate cotton trade, while housewives in Vladivostok adapted it for fish smuggling operations. You have to admire the multi-layered brilliance. Not only were these women conducting business in code, they were actually preserving and improving genuine culinary traditions in the process. The underground economy produced better food than the official system, maintained cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, and created social networks that provided real community support. The government never caught on because they couldn't imagine housewives being capable of such sophistication. Soviet ideology portrayed women as either heroic workers or devoted mothers, never as economic strategists. The idea that babushkas comparing soup recipes were actually running complex financial operations was simply beyond official comprehension. Elena's network had grown to include over 200 active participants by 1966, all coordinating through recipe exchanges that looked completely innocent to outsiders. They had created their own banking system using recipe trades as credit transfers, their own futures market using seasonal cooking plans, and their own international trade using cross-border recipe sharing with relatives in other Soviet republics. The most delicious irony was that these coded recipes often produced genuinely superior borscht. The women were so committed to maintaining their cover that they became excellent cooks in the process. Elena's coded borscht was actually the best soup in her neighborhood. making her reputation as a culinary expert completely legitimate while providing perfect cover for her role as an economic revolutionary. The recipe revolution had transformed ordinary cooking instructions into revolutionary documents, and the Soviet state had no idea that their citizens were literally eating the evidence of their economic rebellion. Every bowl of borscht had become a small act of capitalism, every shared recipe a declaration of independence from state control. What started as a survival strategy had evolved into something approaching art, the art of hiding a free market economy inside soup recipes, proving that human ingenuity could flourish even under the most oppressive conditions. You're about to witness the most subversive use of communal living spaces in Soviet history, and it's happening right under the noses of the very system that created them. Picture yourself walking down the narrow corridor of a typical Moscow communalka in 1966, past the shared bathroom with its eternal queue, past the single telephone that serves 15 families, and into what the state intended as a symbol of collective socialist living. Instead, you're entering the nerve center of an underground economic empire that would make modern co-working spaces look amateur. Meet Tamara Ivanovna, a 43-year-old seamstress who transformed her communal apartment's kitchen into something the architects never intended: a sophisticated production facility, meeting hall, and distribution center, all disguised as ordinary domestic life. You watch her orchestrate the morning shift change with military precision. As one group of women finishes their borscht production run, another arrives to begin prep work for the evening batch, while a third team manages quality control and packaging. The communalka system had been designed to break down bourgeois family structures and create new socialist communities. Families were crammed together, forced to share kitchens, bathrooms, and living spaces, supposedly to build communist solidarity. Instead, these women had weaponized proximity, turning forced cooperation into voluntary economic collaboration. What the state saw as ideological housing had become an incubator for capitalist innovation. Tamara's building housed 12 families in what had once been a merchant's mansion, with the grand kitchen serving as the communal cooking space. But she recognized what the planners missed. This wasn't just a kitchen, it was a factory floor waiting to happen. The large cooking surfaces could accommodate multiple soup operations simultaneously. The industrial-sized storage areas could hold inventory for the entire network. Most importantly, the constant flow of residents provided perfect cover for the parade of customers and suppliers who needed access. You observe the morning briefing disguised as neighborhood gossip. As women wait for their turn at the stove, Tamara casually mentions that Luba's grandmother is feeling much better, which actually means their Ukrainian beet supplier has resolved her transportation problems. When Olga complains that the children are so picky about their vegetables, she's really reporting that her wealthy customers are demanding even higher quality ingredients and will pay premium prices. The genius lay in exploiting the communalka's natural chaos. With 12 families sharing one kitchen, there was always someone cooking something, always people coming and going, always conversations about food and household management. The perfect camouflage for an operation that processed over 50 liters of borscht daily and generated more income than most state enterprises. Historians still argue whether communal living actually strengthened or weakened Soviet social control, but these women had definitively answered that question. They turned surveillance against itself. In a building where everyone was supposed to watch everyone else for signs of deviance, they'd created a system where everyone was complicit in the same profitable deviance. The collective, as Tamara called her group, had developed an elegant division of labor that maximized both efficiency and security. The morning shift handled procurement and prep work, women with official jobs that gave them access to wholesale markets or transportation network. The afternoon team managed actual cooking, usually housewives with flexible schedules and advanced culinary skills. The evening shift focused on packaging, delivery, and customer service, often involving younger women whose social networks extended beyond the neighborhood. What made this particularly brilliant was how they leveraged each family's official connections. Dmitry from Apartment 7 worked at a railway depot and could arrange special shipping for bulk vegetable orders. Svetlana from Apartment 12 was married to a factory manager who could provide industrial-grade cooking equipment borrowed for extended home use. Pavel from Apartment 3 drove a delivery truck and could distribute borscht across the city during his official routes. The women had essentially created a worker cooperative using the same principles the Soviet state promoted, except they were cooperating to build wealth rather than simply survive. They'd taken Marx's ideas about collective ownership and applied them to private enterprise, creating something that was simultaneously completely socialist and thoroughly capitalist. You watched the quality control process that would impress any modern food manufacturer. Each batch of borscht was tasted by at least 3 different women before approval. Ingredients were sourced according to strict standards: no bruised vegetables, no questionable meat, no substitutions that would compromise the final product. They'd created brand consistency in an economy that barely understood the concept of brands. The security measures were equally impressive. The collective had developed an early warning system that could shut down operations and transform the kitchen back into innocent domestic use within minutes. Lookouts monitored the building entrance and stairwells. Code words could instantly communicate different types of danger. "The milk has gone sour" meant police were in the building, while "we need more salt" indicated suspicious neighbors were asking questions. The most remarkable aspect was how they managed the inevitable personality conflicts and jealousies that arise when neighbors become business partners. Tamara had instituted profit-sharing formulas that accounted for different types of contributions, from those who provided ingredients to those who managed customer relationships. Everyone earned according to their input, but the base cooperative structure ensured that success lifted the entire group. By 1967, Tamara's Communalka operation had become so successful that they were subcontracting work to other communal kitchens across Moscow. They'd created a franchise model where experienced collectives would train new groups, sharing techniques, supplier contacts, and customer bases in exchange for territorial agreements and quality standards compliance. The operation had grown beyond simple borscht sales into a comprehensive food service. They offered custom soups for special occasions, bulk catering for unofficial celebrations, and even home delivery for their most valued customers. They'd become restaurateurs without restaurants, entrepreneurs without licenses, and successful businesswomen without official recognition. The delicious irony was that these communalkas were producing better food, stronger communities, and more economic prosperity than any official Soviet institution. The residents weren't just tolerating their forced proximity, they were profiting from it. The state had created the perfect infrastructure for underground capitalism and didn't even realize it. What had started as survival strategy had evolved into something approaching a business school, teaching women skills in logistics, management, customer service, and financial planning that no official Soviet education provided. They were preparing for an economic future that didn't yet exist, building capitalism in the heart of communism, one communal kitchen at a time. You're about to experience paranoia so thick you could cut it with a beet peeler, and the terrifying realization that your soup pot might be the most dangerous weapon in the Soviet Union. It's 1967, and you're standing in Galina Petrovna's kitchen at 3 a.m., watching her disassemble her entire borscht operation because the babushka from apartment 4B asked one too many questions about ingredient sources. In a society where walls have ears and neighbors have agendas, you're learning that the difference between profit and prison might be as thin as an overheard conversation about vegetable prices. The fear is everywhere, seeping into every interaction like smoke from overcooked cabbage. You see it in the way Galina quickly shoves recipe cards under a loose floorboard when footsteps echo in the hallway. You feel it in the silence that falls over kitchen conversations when an unfamiliar face appears. You taste it in the tension that flavors every business discussion, because everyone knows that in the Soviet Union, economic success without state approval isn't just illegal, it's evidence of counter-revolutionary thinking. Meet Boris Nikolaevich, the kind of man who makes honest housewives break into cold sweats. He's moved into apartment 6A with his wife and teenage daughter, and something about him sets off every alarm bell the women have developed over years of underground operations. Maybe it's how he asks too many friendly questions about neighborhood cooking traditions. Maybe it's how he always seems to be in the hallway when ingredient deliveries arrive. Or maybe it's the way his wife nervously deflects invitations to join the collective, as if she's been warned against getting too close to her neighbors. The surveillance state had evolved far beyond uniformed agents and obvious informants. By the mid-1960s, the KGB had perfected the art of neighborhood monitoring through seemingly ordinary citizens who reported suspicious activities in exchange for small privileges, better apartment assignments, educational opportunities for their children, or simply the security of knowing they wouldn't be the ones under investigation. The result was a society where trust had become a luxury few could afford. Galina's network had developed countermeasures that would impress modern intelligence agencies. They'd instituted background checks disguised as social conversations, carefully investigating new residents' work histories, family connections, and reasons for moving to the neighborhood. They'd created testing protocols where suspicious individuals were fed false information to see if it surfaced in official channels. Most importantly, they'd developed the discipline to sacrifice profit for security, shutting down operations entirely rather than risk exposure. You watch the elaborate dance of verification that surrounds every new potential customer or supplier. When Maria Sergeevna from the textile factory expresses interest in joining the Borscht network, she's not simply welcomed aboard. Instead, she's subjected to weeks of casual interrogation disguised as friendship. Her existing customers vouch for her character. Her neighbors are subtly questioned about her family background. Her children are observed to ensure they don't exhibit the coached behavior that often marked informants' families. Historians still argue whether Stalin's death in 1953 actually reduced the surveillance state or simply made it more sophisticated. But for these women, the threat felt more dangerous than ever precisely because it had become less visible. At least under Stalin, you knew who the enemies were. By the 1960s, your enemy might be the friendly grandmother who complimented your cooking while memorizing your ingredient sources. The paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. The state had begun to notice that too many citizens seemed to be eating better than their official salaries should allow. Store managers reported discrepancies between recorded sales and actual inventory levels. Factory supervisors noted that workers were bringing elaborate lunches that couldn't possibly come from state canteens. Most dangerously, some party officials' wives were asking uncomfortable questions about where their neighbors obtained such high-quality ingredients. The women developed communication protocols that assumed constant surveillance. Important conversations happened only while cooking, with running water providing audio cover. Business discussions were conducted during walks through parks where electronic surveillance was impossible. Critical information was never written down, instead transmitted through the recipe codes that had become increasingly sophisticated and increasingly suspicious to anyone who understood what to look for. You observe the psychological toll this constant vigilance extracted. Galina had developed a nervous habit of checking her apartment for listening devices, running her hands along walls and furniture as if she could detect hidden microphones through touch. Other women reported insomnia, jumping at unexpected sounds, and an inability to relax even in their own homes. The success of their operations was being measured not just in profits, but in the price paid in mental health and family relationships. The network had created elaborate emergency protocols for different threat levels. Code Yellow meant increased caution, suspicious activity that warranted heightened awareness but didn't require operational changes. Code Orange triggered temporary shutdown of new customer recruitment and enhanced security measures for existing operations. Code Red meant complete cessation of all activities, destruction of evidence, and preparation for possible arrest. The most sophisticated defense was their development of plausible cover stories that could explain any suspicious activity. Large quantities of vegetables became preparations for fictional family celebrations. Unusual amounts of cash were explained as savings for hypothetical appliance purchases. Frequent visitors were always distant relatives in need of temporary assistance. They'd created an entire mythology of normal life that could withstand casual investigation. The psychological warfare worked both ways. The women learned to identify surveillance through patterns of behavior that seemed innocent but revealed themselves over time. Real informants often tried too hard to appear normal, asking slightly too many questions or showing interest in details that genuine neighbors would ignore. They developed tests, casual lies about sources or prices that would appear in official reports if someone was actually reporting their conversations. By 1968, the paranoia had become so intense that some networks disbanded entirely, their members deciding that no amount of profit was worth the constant fear. Others adapted by becoming even more sophisticated, essentially evolving into professional espionage operations that happened to use soup as their cover story. The most successful groups were those that learned to balance caution with operation, maintaining enough activity to remain profitable while staying invisible enough to survive. The greatest tragedy was how the surveillance state poisoned community relationships that had nothing to do with underground economics. Women who might have become genuine friends instead regarded each other with suspicion. Neighbors who could have provided mutual support instead maintained careful distance. The communalkas that had fostered cooperation now bred isolation, as everyone wondered who was watching and who was reporting. But the women persisted, because stopping meant admitting defeat to a system that seemed determined to keep them dependent and powerless. Every successful Borscht transaction was a small victory against oppression. Every satisfied customer a proof that citizens could create value despite official obstacles. They'd learned to live with fear because the alternative, giving up their economic independence, was even more terrifying than the possibility of imprisonment. You're about to discover that in the underground soup economy, not all borscht was created equal, and the difference between peasant purple and aristocrat crimson could mean the gap between survival and luxury in a society that officially claimed to have abolished class distinctions. It's 1968, and you're witnessing something that would make Mark spin in his mausoleum, a sophisticated hierarchy of soup quality that created its own caste system, complete with status symbols, exclusive access, and social climbing opportunities that rivaled any capitalist country. Meet Nina Alexandrovna, whose premium imperial borscht commanded prices that would make a factory director's monthly salary disappear in a single transaction. You watch her inspect each beet with the intensity of a diamond appraiser, rejecting perfectly good vegetables that would satisfy ordinary customers but fail to meet her impossibly high standards. Her soup isn't just food, it's a luxury good, a status symbol, and a statement about who you are in Soviet society when nobody is supposed to be better than anyone else. The hierarchy had emerged naturally as the network matured and diversified. At the bottom were the workers' special soups, hearty, filling, affordable borscht made with standard ingredients and sold to families who needed nutrition more than prestige. These were honest soups for honest people, the bread and butter of the underground economy that kept ordinary families fed when state stores failed them. Above that sat the holiday-grade borscht, made with premium ingredients for special occasions when families wanted to celebrate but couldn't afford restaurant prices. These soups featured fresher vegetables, real beef instead of questionable scraps, and careful seasoning that transformed humble ingredients into something approaching restaurant quality. They were the middle market, satisfying customers who wanted more than survival but couldn't afford true luxury. At the apex reigned Nina's imperial-grade borscht, and you're about to learn why Communist Party officials' wives paid black market prices for soup that cost more than some people's monthly rent. The ingredients read like a fantasy catalog of unavailable luxuries. Ukrainian sugar beets so fresh they still had dirt on them, Siberian beef from cattle that lived better than most Soviet citizens, Georgian herbs smuggled across internal borders, and Polish sour cream obtained through connections that could end careers if discovered. But the real difference wasn't just ingredients, it was the entire production process. Nina had studied classical French cooking techniques through smuggled cookbooks, learning methods that transformed simple vegetable soup into culinary art. Her borscht was clarified to crystal clarity, while maintaining full flavor, balanced with seasonings unavailable to ordinary cooks, and finished with garnishes that turned each bowl into a presentation worthy of the Kremlin dining rooms. You observe the tasting ritual that accompanied each imperial-grade delivery. Nina personally sampled every batch, adjusting seasoning with the precision of a chemist. The soup was served in borrowed crystal bowls with real silver spoons, because she understood that luxury is as much about presentation as ingredients. Her customers weren't just buying soup, they were buying an experience of abundance in a society built on scarcity. The social dynamics were fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Historians still argue whether the Soviet system actually eliminated class consciousness or simply drove it underground, but Nina's customer base provided definitive answers. Her imperial-grade borscht was purchased almost exclusively by the wives of party officials, factory directors, and successful black market operators, the very people who benefited most from the system they claimed to serve. These women couldn't publicly flaunt their privileged positions, but they could serve soup that demonstrated their access to resources ordinary citizens couldn't imagine. When Comrade Director's wife hosted her weekly bridge game, the borscht quality sent subtle messages about her husband's importance and her family's connections. In a society where explicit status symbols were ideologically forbidden, soup had become the ultimate stealth luxury. The pricing structure reflected this social positioning. Workers' special sold for modest markups over ingredients, maybe 3 rubles for a liter that cost 2 rubles to produce. Holiday grade commanded premium pricing of 5 to 7 rubles for superior quality. But imperial grade borscht sold for 15 to 20 rubles per liter, prices that represented not just ingredient costs but exclusivity, craftsmanship, and the privilege of accessing something genuinely superior in a system designed to provide mediocrity to everyone. Nina had inadvertently created something approaching a luxury brand, complete with waiting lists and customer loyalty that advertising agencies would envy. Her imperial customers didn't just buy soup, they bought membership in an exclusive club of people who could afford the best. Some wealthy customers ordered Nina's borscht for events they couldn't attend personally, sending the soup as gifts that demonstrated their sophistication and connections. The quality differences were real and measurable. Standard network borscht was perfectly adequate nutrition that satisfied hunger and provided reasonable flavor. Nina's imperial grade was a completely different product. Complex, sophisticated, memorable food that could compete with anything served in Moscow's best restaurants, if those restaurants had been able to obtain such ingredients. But the hierarchy created its own problem. Lower-tier producers began attempting to counterfeit premium products, creating imperial-style soups with inferior ingredients sold at premium prices. Nina had to develop authentication methods, signature flavor profiles, specific presentation styles, and trusted distribution channels that protected her reputation and her customers' investments. The competition drove innovation throughout the network. Producers experimented with new ingredients, developed signature techniques, and created specializations that differentiated their products. Some women became known for their exceptional meat borscht, others for vegetarian versions that satisfied Jewish customers who couldn't mix meat and dairy. The underground economy was developing the kind of product diversity that the official system completely lacked. You watch Nina train her apprentices, passing down techniques that represented years of experimentation and refinement. These weren't just cooking lessons, they were business school, teaching women how to create premium products, manage exclusive customer relationships, and build brands that commanded loyalty in competitive markets. Skills the Soviet education system never taught because it never imagined citizens would need them. The irony was delicious and depressing simultaneously. In a society supposedly built on equality, the underground soup economy had recreated class distinctions with ruthless efficiency. The wealthy ate better, lived better, and enjoyed privileges that their official ideology claimed didn't exist. The difference was that now these privileges were hidden behind kitchen doors and disguised as simple soup transactions. You're about to embark on smuggling routes that would make Cold War spy novels seem like children's bedtime stories, except instead of state secrets, these women are risking their lives for Polish kielbasa and Hungarian paprika. It's 1969, and you're crammed into the back of a produced truck with Katerina Wojcik, watching the Polish-Soviet border approach through a gap in potato sacks while she explains how a housewife from Krakow became the most dangerous sausage smuggler in Eastern Europe. The cross-border ingredient trade had evolved far beyond simple vegetable procurement. As the borscht networks grew more sophisticated and their customers more demanding, ordinary Soviet ingredients weren't enough to maintain competitive advantage. The women needed access to the kind of specialty items that could transform good soup into transcendent soup, and those items existed just beyond the Iron Curtain's heavily guarded borders. Katerina had started innocently enough, visiting relatives in the Soviet Union and bringing small gifts of Polish food that simply didn't exist in Soviet stores. But when Moscow housewives tasted sausage made with real spices and paprika that actually had flavor, they were willing to pay prices that transformed Katerina from casual visitor into professional smuggler. By 1968, she was making monthly family visits that generated more income than her husband's factory job back in Poland. You observe the elaborate preparation that goes into each border crossing. The truck's cargo has been carefully arranged to create hidden compartments behind legitimate vegetable shipment. Katerina's clothes have been modified with secret pockets that can hold small, high-value items like saffron and real vanilla. Even her shoes have been altered with false heels containing concentrated spice pastes that border guards would never think to check. The genius lay in exploiting the bureaucratic chaos that plagued Soviet border management. Guards were trained to look for weapons, propaganda materials, and currency, not food items that appeared to be personal provisions. A middle-aged woman carrying sausages for her grandmother looked like family devotion, not international smuggling. The authorities had created a system so focused on political threats that they'd overlooked economic ones. But the real breakthrough came when Katerina partnered with Soviet women who had access to export goods that Poles couldn't obtain. The trade became bidirectional, Polish sausage and spices moving east, while Soviet caviar and vodka moved west. They'd created their own version of international commerce, using the same principle that drove official trade but with better customer service and higher quality products. Historians still argue whether the socialist countries' trade restrictions actually protected their economies or simply created opportunities for underground entrepreneurs, but these women had clearly chosen their side. They were building capitalism one border crossing at a time, creating supply chains that connected customers in Moscow with producers in Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague. You follow Katerina's network as it expands beyond simple smuggling into sophisticated logistics operations. She'd recruited truck drivers who regularly traveled between socialist countries, railway workers who could arrange special cargo handling, and even low-level customs officials whose wives happened to be excellent cooks and valued customers. The network had grown to include participants from 6 different countries, all connected by their shared belief that citizens deserved better food than their governments provided. The routes themselves were masterpieces of creative geography. The direct Moscow-Warsaw route was too heavily monitored, so ingredients traveled circuitous paths that might take them through Kiev, Minsk, and Vilnius before reaching their final destinations. Sausages shipped from Krakow might spend weeks traveling through the Soviet rail system disguised as industrial equipment, while Hungarian paprika could cross 3 borders hidden in diplomatic pouches arranged through sympathetic embassy staff. The most dangerous aspect wasn't the border crossing, it was the distribution networks within the Soviet Union. Once Polish sausage reached Moscow, it had to be integrated into existing Borscht operations without attracting attention from competitors or authorities. This required coordination between smugglers, producers, and customers that resembled military operations more than cooking circles. Katerina had developed a customer base that included some of the most powerful women in Soviet society, wives of officials who could ensure safe passage for her operations in exchange for access to ingredients their husbands' positions couldn't provide through official channels. It was corruption disguised as culinary appreciation, and it created protection networks that extended from local police to ministry-level bureaucrats. The quality differences were immediately apparent to anyone who tasted the results. Polish kielbasa transformed ordinary borscht into something approaching restaurant quality. Hungarian paprika added complexity and depth that Soviet spices simply couldn't match. Romanian sour cream provided richness that made ordinary dairy products taste like water. These weren't minor improvements, they were fundamental upgrades that justified the enormous risks involved in obtaining them. You watch the tasting sessions where Moscow housewives sample new ingredients like wine connoisseurs evaluating rare vintages. The women had developed sophisticated palates that could detect quality differences invisible to ordinary consumers. They understood that their customers weren't just buying soup. They were buying access to flavors that official ideology claimed were unnecessary luxuries but human nature recognized as essential pleasures. The international network had created its own diplomatic relations between socialist countries that had nothing to do with official government policies. Polish women were learning about Soviet customer preferences, Hungarian suppliers were adapting their products for Russian tastes, and Czech intermediaries were developing expertise in cross-border logistics that would serve them well in future legitimate businesses. By 1970, the ingredient smuggling operations had become so sophisticated that they were essentially running parallel import-export businesses between socialist countries. They'd created their own trade agreements, established their own quality standards, and developed their own payment systems that bypassed official banking entirely. Currency flowed between countries through networks of trusted women who understood that reputation was more valuable than any government guarantee. The most remarkable aspect was how these operations improved food quality throughout the region. Soviet customers who tasted Polish sausage began demanding higher standards from local producers. Polish women exposed to Soviet preservation techniques improved their own food storage method. Hungarian spice merchants learned about Russian flavor preferences and adjusted their products accordingly. The underground economy was driving innovation and quality improvements that official trade relationships had failed to achieve. The women had proved that ordinary citizens could create international commerce that served real human needs better than government bureaucracies. They were building economic relationships based on mutual benefit rather than political ideology, and they were doing it one smuggled sausage at a time. But success brought new dangers, as authorities began to notice that citizens in border regions seemed to be eating suspiciously well, and questions were being asked about where exactly all these foreign ingredients were coming from. You're about to discover how a bowl of soup became more valuable than a month's salary, and why Soviet housewives developed mathematical skills that would make Harvard economists weep with envy. It's 1970, and you're sitting at Vera Stepanovna's kitchen table watching her calculate exchange rates for a barter economy so complex it makes cryptocurrency trading look like children's arithmetic. In a society where private business was illegal but necessity was universal, these women had invented their own economic system, and they were running it with the precision of Swiss bankers. The mathematics of soup weren't just about ingredient costs and profit margins. Vera had to factor in risk premiums for smuggled ingredients, seasonal price fluctuations for local vegetables, transportation costs for cross-border supplies, and most importantly, the social value of providing something genuinely superior in a system designed to provide mediocrity to everyone. Her pricing models would have impressed business schools that didn't yet exist in the Soviet Union. You watch her work through a typical calculation for premium borscht production. Polish kielbasa costs 12 rubles per kilogram on the black market. That's triple what Soviet sausage would cost if you could find Soviet sausage that was actually edible. Hungarian paprika runs 8 rubles for a small container that would season maybe 20 liters of soup. Fresh Ukrainian beets are 4 rubles per kilogram, assuming Katerina's supply network hasn't been disrupted by border security. Add labor, risk, and reasonable profit, and a liter of premium borscht carries a wholesale cost of approximately 15 rubles. But that's just the beginning of Vera's economic wizardry. She's discovered that different customer segments will pay vastly different prices for identical products depending on how they're presented and when they're delivered. Factory workers' wives might pay 8 rubles for weekend soup that supplements their family's nutrition. Office managers' wives will pay 12 rubles for the same soup if it's positioned as convenience food for busy professionals. But party officials' wives, they'll pay 25 rubles for soup that's presented as exclusive artisanal cuisine, especially if delivery includes crystal bowls and silver spoons borrowed from pre-revolutionary family collections. The genius lies in understanding that she's not really selling soup. She's selling solutions to problems that the official economy can't address. Busy mothers need nutritious meals that don't require hours of shopping and preparation. Social climbers need status symbols that demonstrate their family's success without violating ideological taboos. Food lovers need flavors and quality that state canteens and restaurants simply can't provide. Vera had identified multiple market segments within Soviet society that weren't supposed to exist but clearly demanded different products at different price points. Historians still argue whether Soviet citizens were as economically sophisticated as their Western counterparts, but Vera's customer base proves that necessity breeds expertise faster than any university education. Her clients had learned to evaluate quality, compare value, and make purchasing decisions based on complex calculations about household budgets, social positioning, and risk tolerance. They were practicing capitalism without calling it capitalism, because calling it capitalism could get them arrested. You observe Vera's seasonal planning process, which rivals any agricultural commodity trader's analysis. Spring means fresh vegetables become available, reducing ingredient costs and allowing for price competition. Summer brings peak production season when she can maximize volume and build inventory for winter scarcity. Fall requires massive preservation operations and stockpiling imported ingredients before winter transportation becomes difficult. Winter means premium pricing for stored goods and heavy reliance on smuggled ingredients that command extraordinary prices. The women had developed their own futures markets, accepting advance payments for soup to be delivered during peak demand periods. Customers who paid in advance received discounted prices, while Vera got capital to invest in ingredient stockpiling and equipment improvements. They'd essentially created agricultural commodity contracts without understanding the terminology, because understanding the terminology wasn't necessary. Understanding the economics was. But the most sophisticated aspect was how Vera calculated income supplementation for her network participants. She'd recognized that different women had different economic needs and different capabilities, requiring variable compensation structures that maximized participation while maintaining quality standards. Women with official jobs that provided access to ingredients earned different rates than those who contributed primarily labor. Participants with transportation capabilities received premium compensation for logistics work. Those with customer relationship skills earned commissions based on sales volume and customer retention. The network had evolved into something approaching a worker cooperative, except it was more responsive to individual needs than most official cooperatives. Vera's profit-sharing formulas accounted for family size, official income levels, and special circumstances like medical expenses or educational costs for children. They'd created their own social safety net within the underground economy, providing economic security that the official system promised but rarely delivered. You watch Vera negotiate a complex three-way trade that would make international commodity brokers jealous. She's arranging to exchange premium borscht for a customer's husband's factory's aluminum cookware, which she'll then trade to Polish suppliers for kielbasa, which will improve her soup quality and allow her to charge higher prices to a different customer segment. 3 separate transactions, 5 different participants, and value creation for everyone involved, all disguised as neighborly favors between housewives. The mathematics extended beyond simple pricing into sophisticated risk management. Vera had calculated optimal inventory levels that balanced storage costs against stockout risks. She'd developed supplier diversification strategies that protected against disruptions to any single ingredient source. Most importantly, she'd created customer loyalty programs that ensured steady demand even when competitors offered lower prices. By 1971, Vera's operation was generating approximately 400 rubles monthly profit, more than many factory managers earned officially, and certainly more than any housewife was supposed to earn from domestic activities. She'd proved that women could be just as economically productive as men, given access to markets and freedom to innovate. The underground soup economy was essentially a laboratory for testing economic theories that official ideology claimed were impossible. The financial success enabled investments in quality improvements that created competitive advantages. Vera purchased real restaurant equipment through black market channels, improving both production efficiency and product quality. She hired specialists to teach advanced cooking techniques, transforming her operation from amateur enthusiasm into professional expertise. Most importantly, she reinvested profits into network expansion, bringing more women into profitable participation while building the infrastructure for even larger operations. But success brought scrutiny, and Vera was beginning to realize that earning more than a factory director while officially unemployed was exactly the kind of mathematics that attracted unwanted attention from authorities who understood economics far better than their ideology suggested they should. The revolution wasn't just about soup. It was about proving that citizens could create value, build wealth, and solve problems when given freedom to use their intelligence and initiative. And the mathematics were undeniable. The underground economy was working better than the official one. You're about to witness the moment when the unstoppable force of housewife entrepreneurship meets the immovable object of Soviet state security. And spoiler alert, the KGB had no idea what they were up against. It's 1972, and you're hiding behind a stack of flour sacks in Nina Georgievna's basement storage room, watching through a crack in the door as three men in identical brown coats systematically destroy what took her 4 years to build. But here's the thing about trying to arrest an economy. You can smash the pots, but you can't arrest the knowledge. And these women are about to teach the secret police a lesson in resilience that would make cockroaches jealous. The operation began at dawn with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested months of planning. Simultaneous raids hit 12 different apartments across Moscow, each targeting a known hub of the Borscht network. You watch Agent Volkov methodically photograph Nina's ingredients as if documenting evidence of international espionage, apparently unaware that he's essentially conducting a raid on a grocery store that happens to be located in someone's kitchen. The charges were creatively bureaucratic, because the Soviet legal system had never anticipated the need to prosecute soup-based capitalism. Nina was accused of parasitic exploitation of socialist resources, which sounded serious until you realized it meant she was buying vegetables and cooking them for profit. Her customers were charged with participation in unlicensed commercial activities, which was equally impressive legal language for buying soup from neighbors. But the KGB had fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. They'd approached the Borscht networks as if they were traditional criminal organizations with hierarchical leadership, centralized operations, and vulnerable command structures. Instead, they'd stumbled into something closer to a biological system, a distributed network of independent operators who could adapt, evolve, and regenerate faster than any bureaucracy could suppress them. You observe the immediate aftermath of the raids, and it's like watching a forest respond to fire. The women don't panic or abandon their operations, they adapt. Within hours of Nina's arrest, her regular customers are receiving coded messages about temporary supply disruptions. Her suppliers are quietly redistributing inventory to other network participants. Her recipes and customer lists have already been memorized and scattered among trusted associates who can rebuild her operation within weeks. Historians still argue whether the 1972 crackdown was motivated by economic concerns or ideological panic, but the evidence suggests the authorities were genuinely surprised by the scale and sophistication of what they discovered. The raids uncovered operations generating hundreds of thousands of rubles annually, involving thousands of participants, and extending across multiple Soviet republics. This wasn't amateur profiteering. It was an alternative economy that rivaled official institutions in scope and exceeded them in efficiency. The women's response to persecution revealed organizational capabilities that would impress modern resistance movement. They developed communication networks that could operate under complete surveillance, financial systems that functioned without banks, and leadership structures that survived the arrest of key participants. The KGB had arrested the visible operators, but the invisible infrastructure remained intact. Meet Larissa Mikhailovna, who stepped into Nina's role within a week of the arrests. She'd been apprenticing under Nina for 2 years, learning not just cooking techniques but business management, customer relations, and most importantly, operational security. The network hadn't just created economic value, it had created institutional knowledge that could survive individual persecution. They'd built something bigger than any single participant. The government's mistake was treating the Borscht economy as if it were optional luxury rather than essential service. While officials celebrated their successful raids on parasitic elements, ordinary citizens were discovering that their food quality had deteriorated overnight. Store shelves that had never been well-stocked seemed even emptier without the underground alternative. Families that had relied on network suppliers found themselves back to queuing for hours for inferior products. You watched the reconstruction process, which demonstrates organizational resilience that would make military strategists jealous. The women had developed redundant systems for every critical function. Multiple suppliers for each ingredient, multiple production facilities for each customer base, multiple distribution channels for each market segment. The raids had disrupted operations but hadn't destroyed capabilities. The most brilliant defensive innovation was the development of sleeper cells, women who had been trained in network operations but remained inactive until needed. When active operators were arrested, these sleepers could activate within days, using prepositioned resources and pre-established relationships to restore service level. The KGB thought they were fighting shopkeepers, but they were actually fighting an organization that had learned to think like guerrilla warriors. The legal proceedings revealed the state's confusion about how to handle economic crimes that didn't fit existing categories. Nina was eventually sentenced to 18 months in a labor camp for economic parasitism, but her lawyers successfully argued that she was actually performing valuable social services by improving nutrition for working families. The court couldn't quite explain why feeding people better food was counter-revolutionary, especially when state institutions were failing to provide adequate nutrition. But the real victory came in the economic response to persecution. Rather than destroying the underground economy, the raids had proved its importance and demonstrated the government's inability to provide adequate alternatives. Within 6 months, operations had not only recovered but expanded, as new participants joined networks that had proved their resilience under pressure. The women had learned valuable lessons about operational security that made future networks even more sophisticated. They developed better compartmentalization protocols that limited how much damage any single arrest could cause. They'd created more effective early warning systems that could detect surveillance before raids occurred. Most importantly, they'd proved to themselves that they could survive government persecution and continue providing services their communities needed. By 1973, the reconstituted networks were not only more secure but more profitable than their predecessors. The raids had actually served as advertisement, proving to potential customers that the underground economy was important enough to attract official attention while demonstrating its resilience under pressure. Being persecuted by the KGB was essentially a quality certification that no official institution could provide. The government had intended to destroy an illegal economy, but they'd actually validated its importance and strengthened its defenses. The women had learned that they weren't just cooking soup. They were challenging a system that couldn't tolerate citizens creating value independently. And they discovered that the system was far more fragile than its propaganda suggested. The revolution had survived its first real test, and it had emerged stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. The KGB could arrest the entrepreneurs, but they couldn't arrest entrepreneurship itself. You're about to discover how Soviet geography became the secret weapon of underground soup empires, and why a bowl of Georgian borscht could start international incidents between regions that weren't even supposed to compete with each other. It's 1973, and you're traveling on the overnight train from Tbilisi to Leningrad with Nana Tsereteli, watching her carefully guard a suitcase full of what appears to be ordinary vegetables but are actually the crown jewels of the Caucasian borscht trade. Ingredients so distinctive they've created their own regional economies within the larger Soviet black market. The regional variations had emerged naturally as local networks adapted to their specific advantages and limitations. Georgian women like Nana had access to herbs and spices that didn't exist anywhere else in the Soviet Union, creating borscht with flavor profiles that Moscow customers would pay extraordinary premiums to experience. Their soup wasn't just different, it was exotic, offering tastes that transported customers to regions they'd never visit and experiences their official lives couldn't provide. You observe how Nana's Georgian network exploited their unique position at the intersection of European and Asian trade routes. Tbilisi had always been a crossroads city, and the women had inherited centuries of trading traditions that the Soviet system had tried to suppress but never completely eliminated. They understood how to move goods across vast distances, how to maintain quality during long transportation, and most importantly, how to create desire for products that customers had never imagined they wanted. The Georgians had developed signature techniques that were impossible to replicate elsewhere. Their borscht featured herbs like tarragon and cilantro that simply didn't grow in northern climates, combined with preservation methods that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. They'd created something that was simultaneously traditional Georgian cuisine and revolutionary Soviet entrepreneurship, a product that satisfied both cultural pride and economic necessity. Meanwhile, up in Leningrad, you meet Anastasia Volkonsky, descendant of minor nobility who'd survived Stalin's purges by becoming the most accomplished housewife in her communalka. Her network specialized in what she called imperial standard borscht, recreating recipes from pre-revolutionary Russia that appealed to customers who missed flavors from a world that officially had never existed. Her soup was political nostalgia disguised as premium dining. Historians still argue whether regional variations in Soviet black markets reflected genuine cultural differences or simple economic opportunism, but these women had clearly chosen cultural authenticity as their competitive advantage. They weren't just selling soup, they were selling identity, heritage, and connection to traditions that the Soviet system had tried to erase but couldn't completely destroy. The Ukrainian networks had developed their own specialization around what they called peasant perfection borscht, soup that elevated humble ingredients to extraordinary levels through techniques that had been refined over centuries of rural cooking. Their competitive advantage wasn't exotic ingredients, but rather extraordinary skill in maximizing flavor from basic components. They turned necessity into artistry, creating products that proved you didn't need luxury ingredients to achieve luxury results. You follow the complex trading relationships that had developed between regional networks. Georgian women shipped their exotic herbs north in exchange for Baltic fish that couldn't be obtained in the Caucasus. Ukrainian suppliers traded their perfect root vegetables for Siberian preserved meats that provided protein unavailable in agricultural regions. Estonian networks offered access to Finnish ingredients smuggled across relatively porous northern borders in exchange for Central Asian spices that came through traditional Silk Road routes. The regional specialization had created its own form of internal Soviet trade that was far more efficient than official distribution systems. While state planners struggled to coordinate agricultural production across vast distances and diverse climates, the Borscht networks had developed supply chains that actually worked. They'd created market mechanisms that allocated resources according to demand rather than bureaucratic formulas, and they'd done it using the same transportation infrastructure the state used, but with better results. The competition between regions had driven innovation that official agricultural programs had failed to achieve. Georgian networks were constantly experimenting with new herb combinations to maintain their advantage over Armenian suppliers. Ukrainian women were refining traditional techniques to compete with Polish ingredients smuggled across western borders. Siberian operations were developing preservation methods that allowed them to compete with fresh ingredients shipped from Southern Republic. But the most fascinating development was how regional borscht variations had become symbols of cultural resistance within officially homogeneous Soviet society. Customers weren't just buying soup, they were buying connection to regional identities that communist ideology claimed were obsolete. A Moscow party official's wife who served Georgian borscht was making a statement about sophistication and cultural appreciation that went far beyond simple meal planning. You watch Nana navigate the complex negotiations required to establish her Leningrad operations. She can't simply start selling Georgian borscht in competition with established local networks. That would violate the territorial agreements that kept the underground economy stable. Instead, she has to negotiate franchise arrangements, supply partnerships, and customer sharing agreements that respect existing relationships while creating opportunities for expansion. The regional networks had essentially created their own version of federalism within the centralized Soviet system. Each region maintained operational autonomy while participating in larger economic relationships that benefited everyone involved. They'd proved that diversity and competition could coexist with cooperation and mutual support, lessons that official Soviet ideology claimed were impossible to combine. By 1974, the regional variations had become so sophisticated that they were essentially operating parallel cultural institutions alongside their economic functions. Georgian networks weren't just preserving culinary traditions, they were maintaining language, music, and social customs that connected participants to their heritage. Ukrainian operations weren't just selling soup, they were keeping alive agricultural knowledge and rural wisdom that urbanization was threatening to destroy. The most remarkable aspect was how regional pride had enhanced rather than undermined network cooperation. Instead of fragmenting into competing factions, the women had learned to leverage their differences as complementary advantage. They created an economy where diversity was strength rather than weakness, where regional specialization created opportunities for everyone rather than zero-sum competition. But success had attracted attention from authorities who were beginning to realize that the underground soup economy wasn't just about food. It was about identity, culture, and political autonomy that challenged fundamental assumptions about Soviet unity and control. The revolution had gone regional, and each variation was proving that citizens could maintain their distinctiveness while building economic prosperity that served everyone's interests better than official programs designed to eliminate such differences. You're about to witness the most heartbreaking betrayal in underground soup history, as innocent children become unwitting couriers in an economic espionage network that would make their parents proud and terrified in equal measure. It's 1974, and you're watching 10-year-old Misha Petrov skip down Gorky Street with a school satchel that contains not homework, but 20 jars of premium borscht worth more than his father's monthly salary, completely unaware that he's become the most successful smuggler in Moscow while thinking he's just helping babushka with her cooking. The recruitment of children wasn't planned. It was born from desperate necessity when adult courier networks became too dangerous after the 1972 raids. The women discovered what every parent knows but every security agency forgets. Children are invisible to adult surveillance because adults assume they're not important enough to watch. A 10-year-old carrying soup to grandmother looks like family devotion, not international commerce, especially when that 10-year-old genuinely believes he's just being helpful to the adults who love him. Meet Galina Ivanovna, Misha's grandmother and architect of the most sophisticated child courier network in Soviet history. You watch her carefully train her grandson in what appears to be ordinary household responsibilities but are actually advanced logistics operations. Misha learns to recognize quality vegetables not because he's studying agriculture, but because his routes to different apartments require him to evaluate merchandise and report back on customer satisfaction. He's becoming a business analyst without understanding the business. The genius lay in exploiting children's natural behavior patterns that adult networks couldn't replicate. Kids routinely travel between apartments in communalkas, carrying messages and small items for extended family networks. They visit friends' homes, participate in after-school activities, and move through neighborhoods without attracting attention from authorities who are trained to notice unusual adult behavior. Most importantly, they possess the kind of innocent enthusiasm that makes customers trust them automatically. You observe Galina's training program, which teaches essential business skills disguised as childhood games. Misha learns to count money through helping grandmother with shopping calculations. He develops memory skills by playing games that require him to remember complex customer preferences and delivery addresses. Most remarkably, he learns to identify suspicious adult behavior and adjust his routes accordingly, essentially mastering counterintelligence techniques while thinking he's playing spy games with his friends. Historians still argue whether using children in underground economic networks constituted exploitation or education, but the results suggest these kids were receiving business training superior to anything available in official Soviet schools. They were learning practical mathematics, customer service, logistics planning, and risk assessment skills that would serve them well regardless of what economic system they eventually lived under. The children's networks had developed their own internal culture that blended childhood games with serious business operations. Kids created elaborate codes using comic book characters to communicate about different soup varieties and customer types. They invented games that let them practice delivery routes while appearing to play normally. Most ingeniously, they developed playground hierarchies based on courier success, turning business achievement into childhood social status without their parents realizing what was happening. You follow Misha on his afternoon delivery route, watching him execute operations that would challenge professional logistics specialists. He maintains mental maps of customer preferences, delivery schedules, and payment arrangements for over 30 regular clients. He can calculate exchange rates between soup varieties and alternative payment methods faster than most adults. Most impressively, he's learned to identify potential security threats and adjust his behavior to avoid suspicion, skills that most adult entrepreneurs never master. But the most sophisticated aspect was how the children created their own quality control systems. Kids who delivered inferior soup faced social ostracism from their peer networks, creating incentives for excellence that no adult supervision could match. They developed reputation systems where successful couriers gained status and privileges, while failures lost access to the games and activities that made participation enjoyable. The children were also inadvertently serving as market research, reporting customer reactions and preferences with the kind of detailed honesty that adult business relationships rarely achieved. Misha could tell his grandmother exactly which customers complained about seasoning, which ones asked for larger portions, and which ones seemed interested in premium upgrades, information that was invaluable for business development and customer relationship management. The network had grown to include over 50 children across Moscow by 1975, each handling specialized routes and customer segments according to their individual strengths and neighborhood knowledge. Some kids excelled at affluent customer relationships, using their natural charm to build loyalty among party officials' wives. Others specialized in working-class routes where their genuine enthusiasm for helping families resonated with customers who remembered their own childhood struggles. You watched the weekly coordination meetings disguised as birthday parties where Galina and other network organizers received reports from their child couriers. The kids genuinely enjoyed these gatherings, treating them as social events while unknowingly providing detailed business intelligence about market conditions, customer satisfaction, and competitive activities. They'd created corporate reporting systems that were both more accurate and more enjoyable than most official business meetings. The emotional complexity was staggering. These children were experiencing pride, responsibility, and economic success while remaining completely innocent about the legal and political risks their activities involved. They were developing entrepreneurial skills and business acumen while believing they were simply being good grandchildren who helped their families. The adults were simultaneously protecting and endangering them, providing opportunities while creating vulnerabilities that could destroy their futures if discovered. But the children were also inadvertently teaching their adult handlers lessons about innovation and adaptation. Kids suggested delivery methods and customer approaches that adults would never consider. They identified opportunities and solved logistical problems with creative thinking unconstrained by adult assumptions about what was possible or proper. The networks were becoming more successful partly because children approached business challenges without the limitations that adult experience imposed. By 1975, some children were earning more money than their officially employed parents, though they understood their earnings as helping grandmother rather than personal income. They were receiving economic education that prepared them for market economies that didn't yet exist in the Soviet Union, developing skills that would prove invaluable when those economies eventually emerged. The most heartbreaking aspect was how these children were losing their childhood innocence not through official persecution or political indoctrination, but through economic success that taught them to see adults as customers, neighbors as competitors, and family relationships as business opportunities. They were becoming sophisticated entrepreneurs while remaining children, creating psychological complexities that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The revolution had recruited its next generation, and these children would carry forward both the skills and the scars of their early introduction to capitalism hidden within communist society. You're about to discover how Soviet housewives became food scientists without laboratories, developing preservation techniques that would make NASA engineers jealous, all in service of creating a year-round Borscht empire that could survive nuclear winter and government crackdowns with equal resilience. It's October 1975, and you're in Klavdia Sergeevna's basement, surrounded by enough preserved vegetables to feed a small army, watching her demonstrate fermentation methods that her great-grandmother used to survive famines but she's perfected to dominate markets. The Winter Preservation Challenge had become the ultimate test of network sophistication. Any amateur could make decent borscht during summer when fresh ingredients were abundant and transportation was reliable. But maintaining quality, consistency, and profitability through 6 months of Siberian winter, that separated the professionals from the pretenders. The women who mastered preservation controlled the underground economy from November through April, when desperation drove prices to astronomical levels. Klavdia had transformed her basement into something between a chemistry laboratory and a medieval root cellar, equipped with homemade equipment that rivaled industrial food processing facilities. You watch her operate fermentation vessels constructed from repurposed laboratory glassware obtained through black market connections with research institutes. Her temperature control systems use thermostats salvaged from broken refrigerators and heaters built from automotive parts. It's improvised engineering that solves problems Soviet industry couldn't address. The techniques themselves combined traditional peasant wisdom with innovations born from necessity and competition. Klavdia had learned that different vegetables required specific preservation methods to maintain the flavor profiles that distinguished premium borscht from amateur attempts. Beets needed controlled fermentation that concentrated their sweetness while preventing the sourness that ruined inferior preserved versions. Cabbage required precise salt concentrations that preserved texture without overwhelming flavor. Each ingredient demanded its own process, creating production complexity that increased costs but generated competitive advantages worth the investment. You observe the testing protocols that would impress pharmaceutical companies. Every batch of preserved vegetables undergoes taste tests by panels of experienced cooks who can detect quality variations invisible to ordinary consumers. Preservation methods are continuously refined based on customer feedback and seasonal results. Failed experiments are documented and analyzed to prevent future mistakes. They'd created quality control systems that ensured winter soup met summer standards, maintaining customer loyalty through consistency that official food processing could never achieve. Historians still argue whether Soviet agricultural policy actually created food scarcity or simply failed to prevent it, but these women had clearly decided not to wait for official solutions. They were creating their own food security using knowledge and techniques that connected them to centuries of Russian survival wisdom while serving thoroughly modern commercial purposes. The basement operations required logistical planning that would challenge military quartermaster corps. Klavdia had calculated optimal storage ratios for different vegetable types based on customer demand patterns, seasonal price fluctuations, and preservation success rates. Her inventory management systems tracked not just quantities but quality degradation over time, ensuring that older stock moved first while maintaining overall product standard. She'd essentially created warehouse management systems using pencil, paper, and encyclopedic knowledge of her customer base. But the real innovation was in preservation techniques that enhanced rather than merely maintained food quality. Klavdia's fermented beets developed complex flavors that fresh vegetables couldn't match, creating premium products that commanded higher prices than summer soup made with fresh ingredients. Her preserved cabbage retained texture and nutritional value better than anything available in state stores. She'd discovered that proper preservation could improve food rather than simply prevent spoilage. The winter operations also required different supply chain strategies. Summer networks relied on regular deliveries of fresh ingredients, but winter preservation demanded massive procurement operations concentrated into brief harvest periods when quality was highest and prices were lowest. Klavdia coordinated with multiple suppliers to stockpile thousands of kilograms of vegetables during optimal harvest windows, creating purchasing operations that rivaled collective farm procurement in scale and exceeded them in efficiency. You watch the preservation process that begins each September with military precision. Teams of women work around the clock processing vegetables according to recipes that have been refined through years of experimentation. Each method requires specific timing, temperature control, and handling techniques that can't be rushed or simplified without compromising results. It's industrial food processing disguised as enlarged household activities, and it produces results that industrial operations couldn't match. The economic implications were staggering. Winter borscht commanded prices 3 to 4 times higher than summer varieties, not just because of scarcity but because of quality differences that justified premium pricing. Customers who could afford winter soup were essentially buying luxury products that didn't exist anywhere else in the Soviet economy. Klavdia's preserved ingredients were creating dining experiences that connected customers to prosperity and abundance that their political system promised but never delivered. The preservation networks had also created new forms of cooperation between women with complementary skills and resources. Some participants specialized in procurement, using their connections and transportation access to acquire massive quantities during harvest season. Others focused on processing, developing expertise in specific preservation techniques that required knowledge and experience. Distribution specialists managed winter sales and customer relationships, maintaining network connections during months when operations were necessarily more secretive and limited. By 1976, the winter preservation operations had become so sophisticated that they were essentially running seasonal food processing businesses that operated at higher quality standards than official canneries and preserved food facilities. They'd proved that small-scale operations could achieve superior results through attention to quality and customer satisfaction that large-scale socialist production methods couldn't match. The women had discovered that preservation wasn't just about surviving winter. It was about creating products that couldn't be replicated by competitors without equivalent investment in time, skill, and resources. They'd built competitive moats around their operations using traditional techniques applied with modern commercial sophistication, creating barriers to entry that protected their market positions while serving customer needs better than any alternative. But winter preservation also meant increased visibility during seasons when underground operations were supposed to be dormant, creating security challenges that required new forms of operational discipline and risk management. The revolution had learned to hibernate without sleeping, maintaining its strength through months of official scarcity, while preparing for spring expansion that would test whether preservation techniques could support growth as well as survival. You're about to witness the birth of the world's first communist commodity exchange, where lipstick trades for light bulbs and everyone's grandmother suddenly becomes a derivatives trader without understanding what derivatives are. It's 1976, and you're sitting in what appears to be an ordinary apartment building's community room watching Zoya Petrovna facilitate trades that would make Wall Street brokers weep with envy, as she explains how 3 liters of premium borscht can get you everything from imported mascara to Western cigarettes, depending on current market conditions and your negotiation skills. The barter economy had evolved far beyond simple soup for rubles transactions into a sophisticated trading system that connected the underground food networks with every other form of black market commerce in Soviet society. Borscht had become the gold standard of alternative currency, stable in value, universally desired, and divisible into units that could facilitate trades for goods ranging from trivial luxuries to essential services that the official economy couldn't provide. Zoya had recognized the opportunity when customers began offering alternative payment methods during cash shortages. Instead of refusing non-monetary transactions, she developed exchange rates that treated her soup as commodity money. 3 liters of premium borscht equaled 1 tube of Western lipstick. 5 liters could secure a pair of imported nylon stocking. 10 liters might purchase access to a black market doctor who could provide medical care without the months-long waits that characterized official healthcare. You watch the morning trading session that looks like a neighborhood coffee klatch but functions like a commodities market. Women gather with shopping lists that aren't really shopping lists, their trading proposals coded in domestic language that conceals complex bartering operations. Need help with spring cleaning means seeking household repair services. Looking for birthday party supplies indicates desire for luxury consumer goods. Planning special dinner for anniversary suggests interest in trading food for romantic services like restaurant reservations or entertainment access. The genius lay in creating standardized exchange rates that provided pricing stability in an economy where official prices bore no relationship to actual value or availability. Zoya had calculated that 1 liter of her premium borscht represented approximately 4 hours of skilled labor, 2 days of average official wages, or access to luxury goods worth 50 rubles on official markets, when those goods were available at all, which they usually weren't. Historians still argue whether Soviet barter economies developed because of currency shortages or distrust of official monetary systems, but these women had clearly decided that soup was more reliable than rubles. Their borscht retained value regardless of government policy changes, currency devaluations, or political instability that could make official money worthless overnight. The trading network had created its own forms of financial instruments that would be familiar to modern derivatives traders. Borscht futures allowed customers to contract for soup delivery during specific future periods at predetermined exchange rates. Seasonal swaps let participants trade summer access to fresh ingredients for winter delivery of preserved products. Quality derivatives provided price protection for customers who wanted guaranteed premium soup, regardless of ingredient availability fluctuations. You observe the sophisticated risk management that underlies seemingly simple transactions. When Maria Sergeyevna trades borscht for access to her dentist husband's services, both parties are assuming complex risks about future availability, quality maintenance, and service delivery. Zoya must ensure her soup quality remains consistent enough to justify medical care worth hundreds of rubles. Maria must guarantee her husband's continued cooperation and professional competence. They're essentially creating insurance contracts disguised as neighborly favors. The barter system had also solved problems that official Soviet commerce couldn't address. When state stores couldn't provide basic goods like soap, batteries, or light bulbs, the Borscht networks could facilitate trades that connected customers with suppliers who had access to these items through their official jobs or personal connections. They'd created distribution systems that actually worked, using soup as the medium of exchange that made complex multi-party trades possible. But the most remarkable development was how Borscht trading had created its own forms of banking and credit. Zoya maintained detailed records of who owed soup to whom, creating loan systems that allowed customers to receive goods immediately in exchange for future soup delivery. She'd essentially invented consumer credit using vegetable soup as the underlying asset, providing financial services that official Soviet banks couldn't or wouldn't offer to ordinary citizens. The network participants had learned to read market signals that provided information about economic conditions throughout Soviet society. When factory workers started trading more borscht for household repair services, It indicated that official housing maintenance was deteriorating. When party officials' wives increased their soup for luxury goods exchanges, it suggested that official privilege wasn't providing adequate access to desired consumer products. The barter markets were providing economic intelligence that official statistics couldn't capture. You watch Zoya negotiate a complex multi-party trade involving 6 different participants and 8 different goods and services. Her soup will go to a seamstress who will provide clothing alterations for a teacher who will tutor the children of a mechanic who will repair the car of a nurse who will provide medical care for Zoya's mother. 6 degrees of separation connected through Borscht, creating value for everyone involved while bypassing official systems that couldn't facilitate such transactions. The pricing mechanisms had become incredibly sophisticated, accounting for seasonal variations, quality differences, customer preferences, and competitive pressures from other networks. Zoya's exchange rates fluctuated based on ingredient availability, production costs, customer demand, and alternative payment options available to her trading partners. She was essentially running a commodity exchange from her apartment building's community room. By 1977, the barter networks had become so extensive that some participants were earning their entire living through soup-mediated trades without ever handling official currency. They'd created alternative economic systems that provided higher living standards than official employment while building social relationships that official institutions couldn't match. The women had proved that citizens could create their own monetary systems when official currencies failed to serve their needs. They'd built commerce based on trust, reputation, and mutual benefit rather than government authority and legal enforcement. Most importantly, they demonstrated that economic value could be created and exchanged through voluntary cooperation rather than centralized planning. But success had created new challenges, as the barter networks attracted attention from officials who were beginning to realize that citizens were building economic alternatives that competed with and often exceeded official institutions in efficiency and customer satisfaction. The revolution had monetized itself using soup as currency, and the exchange rates were starting to suggest that homemade capitalism might be more valuable than official communism. You're about to witness the moment when the Soviet state finally woke up to discover that babushkas had been running a parallel economy under their noses for over a decade, and their response would make the Spanish Inquisition look subtle by comparison. It's March 1978, and you're crammed under Valentina Mikhailovna's kitchen table, listening to boots stomping overhead as Operation Clean Kettle, the government's hilariously named campaign against parasitic domestic enterprises, turns her apartment into a crime scene because someone apparently decided that cooking soup constitutes an act of treason against the working class. The crackdown wasn't just bigger than 1972's amateur raids. It was a coordinated assault that demonstrated the state had finally grasped the true scope of what these women had built. You watch through a crack in the floorboards as investigators document every jar, every recipe card, every customer list with the methodical precision of archaeologists, uncovering a lost civilization. Because that's essentially what they'd found, an entire economic civilization that had grown within their supposedly controlled society. The operation involved over 500 agents across 12 Soviet republics, targeting not just soup producers but their entire supply networks, customer bases, and financial system. They'd mapped the connections between Georgian herb smugglers and Moscow customers, traced the money flows between Ukrainian vegetable suppliers and Leningrad distributors, and identified the communication networks that coordinated operations across thousands of miles of Soviet territory. It was detective work worthy of international espionage cases, applied to grandmothers who thought they were just feeding their neighborhoods. Operation Clean Kettle revealed government capabilities that most citizens never suspected existed. The authorities had been monitoring apartment building utility usage to identify suspicious cooking patterns. They'd analyzed railway freight records to detect ingredient smuggling operations. They'd even employed food scientists to reverse engineer recipes and identify signature flavors that could trace specific soups back to their producers. The paranoid surveillance state had finally found a target worthy of its technological sophistication. You hear Valentina destroying evidence with practiced efficiency that suggests these women had been preparing for this moment for years. Recipe cards disappear into the apartment building's furnace. Customer lists are flushed down toilets. Money gets distributed to children who are told to buy candy and toys, transforming criminal profits into innocent purchases that investigators couldn't trace or confiscate. They're erasing an entire business empire faster than the authorities can document it. Historians still argue whether Operation Clean Kettle was motivated by economic concerns or ideological panic, but the scope suggests both. The government had discovered that unofficial food networks were serving over 200,000 regular customers across the Soviet Union, generating annual revenues that exceeded many official state enterprises. This wasn't small-scale profiteering. It was an alternative economy that proved citizens could organize production and distribution more efficiently than socialist central planning. The charges were as creative as they were comprehensive. Valentina was accused of systematic exploitation of socialist resources for personal enrichment, which sounded like she'd been running an oil company rather than cooking soup. Her customers faced charges of participation in unlicensed commercial activities and undermining state economic planning through alternative consumption patterns. The legal system was essentially admitting that buying better food constituted an attack on socialist ideology. But the women's response demonstrated organizational sophistication that caught investigators completely off guard. Instead of panicking or abandoning their networks, they'd activated contingency plans that had been years in development. Critical operations shifted to backup locations within hours. Essential personnel assumed false identities and relocated to different cities. Most importantly, they'd prepared financial reserves and legal defenses that could sustain prolonged persecution while protecting the most vulnerable participant. You watch the Underground Railroad that emerges to protect arrested women's families. Children are relocated to relatives in different republics. Elderly parents receive care from network members who weren't targeted in the raids. Financial support flows to families whose primary earners have been imprisoned, ensuring that persecution doesn't destroy the economic security these women had built for their loved ones. They'd created social insurance systems that official institutions couldn't match. The most remarkable aspect was how quickly the networks adapted to operational security measures that transformed them from neighborhood cooperatives into genuine resistance organizations. Communication shifted to codes so sophisticated that intercepted messages appeared to be discussions about gardening and household management. Meeting locations rotated according to predetermined schedules that made surveillance nearly impossible. Financial transactions moved to barter systems that left no paper trails for investigators to follow. The government's biggest mistake was underestimating the network's customer loyalty. Instead of cooperating with investigations, soup customers protected their suppliers with testimonies that portrayed the operations as charitable community services rather than commercial enterprises. Party officials' wives claimed they'd been helping poor neighbors by accepting their surplus cooking. Factory managers insisted they'd been supporting workers' families by purchasing their traditional recipes. The entire customer base had essentially perjured themselves to protect women who'd provided better service than any official institution. The international implications were equally embarrassing for Soviet authorities. Foreign journalists began reporting on government persecution of housewives whose only crime was cooking superior food. Western radio broadcasts described Operation Clean Kettle as evidence that communist economies couldn't compete with grandmother's cooking. The propaganda war that was supposed to demonstrate socialist efficiency had instead highlighted its failures compared to amateur entrepreneurs working in apartment building kitchens. By late 1978, the government was facing a public relations disaster that extended far beyond simple law enforcement. They'd arrested hundreds of women whose families were now struggling with nutrition and economic hardship. They destroyed food networks that had been feeding thousands of customers who couldn't obtain adequate alternatives through official channels. Most problematically, they'd proved that unofficial systems could provide better results than official ones, raising uncomfortable questions about fundamental socialist assumptions. The resistance wasn't just passive, it was actively creative. Women who'd never considered themselves political activists were now viewing their soup operations as acts of resistance against oppression. They'd learned that providing superior customer service was actually a form of protest against systems that treated citizens as recipients of government charity rather than customers deserving quality products and respectful treatment. The crackdown had succeeded in disrupting operations, but it had failed to destroy the knowledge, relationships, and determination that made the networks possible. The women had learned that their economic activities were political acts and that their government viewed citizen success as state failure. They were preparing for a longer struggle that would test whether innovation could survive persecution. The revolution had entered its underground phase, and the women were about to discover whether their entrepreneurial skills could be converted into survival techniques that would preserve their achievements until political conditions allowed them to emerge once again. You're about to witness the most impressive act of collective amnesia in human history, as thousands of Soviet women simultaneously forgot how to cook, where they kept their recipes, and why anyone would think they knew anything about soup beyond boiling water and adding salt. It's 1979, and you're watching Lyudmila Sergeyevna demonstrate the performance of her life, playing a confused housewife who couldn't organize a borscht operation if her life depended on it, which it actually does, while her eyes communicate complex business instructions to network members who are also pretending to be hopelessly incompetent domestic failures. The transition to full underground operations required acting skills that would challenge professional theater companies. These women had to convince investigators that they were simple housewives who'd accidentally stumbled into minor commercial activities, rather than sophisticated entrepreneurs who'd built economic empires through years of careful planning and execution. They had to appear grateful for government intervention that was protecting them from their own naivety, while secretly coordinating resistance operations that would preserve their networks until persecution ended. Ludmila's testimony to investigators was a masterpiece of strategic confusion. You listen as she explains that she sometimes cooked a little extra soup because her poor memory led her to accidentally purchase too many vegetables, and she felt bad about waste, so she shared with neighbors who insisted on paying something even though she told them it wasn't necessary. She's transformed a multi-thousand-ruble operation into a series of innocent misunderstandings perpetrated by a woman too simple to understand basic economics. The collective amnesia extended beyond individual testimonies into systematic destruction of institutional memory. Recipe cards that had taken years to develop and refine disappeared overnight. Customer databases that represented thousands of hours of relationship building evaporated into innocent neighborhood acquaintanceships. Supply chain networks that spanned multiple republics became casual friendships between women who sometimes shared cooking tips with distant relatives. But the most brilliant aspect was how the women used their own cultural stereotypes as camouflage. Soviet society had spent decades portraying housewives as well-meaning but economically naive women who needed state guidance to make rational decisions. The Borscht entrepreneurs had learned to weaponize these stereotypes, presenting themselves as confused domestic workers who couldn't possibly have understood the commercial implications of their activities. You watch the underground continuation of operations that required compartmentalization techniques borrowed from espionage organizations. Critical functions were distributed among participants who didn't know each other's identities or full operational roles. Recipe knowledge was memorized rather than written, passed through verbal traditions that investigators couldn't intercept or confiscate. Customer relationships were maintained through intermediaries who could provide plausible deniability for all parties involved. Historians still argue whether the network's survival during intense persecution demonstrates the strength of their economic foundation or the weakness of Soviet investigative capabilities, but the evidence suggests both factors contributed to their resilience. The women had built operations that served genuine customer needs while developing security protocols that could withstand systematic government assault. The memory purge required incredible discipline from participants who had spent years building reputations based on expertise and reliability. Women who had been recognized as master cooks had to claim they couldn't distinguish quality ingredients from inferior substitutes. Network leaders who had coordinated complex multi-party transactions had to insist they couldn't calculate proper change for simple purchases. Successful entrepreneurs had to portray themselves as accidental participants in activities they didn't understand. The financial disappearing act was equally impressive. Profits that had taken years to accumulate were distributed, hidden, or converted into assets that couldn't be traced to soup operations. Money became jewelry that could be explained as family heirlooms. Savings were transformed into household appliances purchased for cash that appeared to be legitimate accumulated wages. Investment capital disappeared into children's education funds that seemed like normal parental sacrifice. But maintaining underground operations while appearing to have abandoned them required sophisticated coordination that tested every communication and security protocol the networks had developed. You observe coded conversations that appear to be ordinary neighborhood gossip, but actually coordinate supply deliveries, customer service, and quality control for ongoing soup production. The women had learned to conduct business while convincing observers that they'd forgotten how to conduct business. The psychological toll was enormous. Women who had spent years building their identities as successful entrepreneurs now had to present themselves as domestic failures who needed government protection from their own incompetence. Network members who had earned respect through business acumen had to accept social positioning as confused housewives who couldn't manage simple commercial transactions. They were sacrificing their public reputations to preserve their actual capabilities. The underground operations had to develop entirely new production and distribution methods that left no evidence investigators could discover. Soup production moved to constantly rotating locations using equipment that could be quickly assembled and disassembled. Customer service relied on communication methods that appeared completely innocent to surveillance while maintaining the relationship management that kept customers loyal during operational disruptions. By 1980, the networks had essentially created parallel versions of themselves that operated at reduced capacity but maintained core capabilities until full operations could safely resume. They'd preserved essential supply relationships, key customer connections, and critical expertise, while convincing authorities that their previous success had been accidental rather than systematic. The most remarkable achievement was maintaining product quality standards even under operational constraints that would have destroyed most legitimate businesses. Customers continued receiving soup that met their expectations, despite production methods that required constant adaptation to avoid detection. The women had proved that dedication to customer satisfaction could overcome almost any operational challenge. The digital revolution had gone analog, existing entirely in human memory and personal relationships that couldn't be documented, intercepted, or destroyed by government action. They'd created economic institutions that existed only in people's minds and social connections, proving that commerce could survive even when all its physical manifestations were eliminated. But underground operations also meant accepting reduced income, limited growth opportunities, and constant stress that tested whether the network's social foundations were strong enough to sustain prolonged persecution. The women were about to discover whether their revolutionary achievements had created lasting change or merely temporary alternatives that would disappear under pressure. The revolution had learned to hide in plain sight, but invisibility came at costs that would test whether economic success could survive when it had to remain secret from the very people it was designed to serve. You're about to discover how the Iron Curtain became more like a soup strainer, as Soviet housewives created international trade relationships that would make modern EU bureaucrats weep with envy at the sheer efficiency of cross-border Borscht diplomacy. It's 1980, and you're riding in the back of a diplomatic car with Irina Kozlova, watching her conduct what appears to be casual conversation with the Polish consul's wife while actually negotiating trade agreements that connect Hungarian paprika producers with Estonian fish smugglers through a network of embassy personnel who've discovered that soup diplomacy works better than official treaties. The international expansion hadn't been planned. It had emerged organically when embassy families discovered that Soviet housewives could provide better food than official diplomatic commissaries. What started as individual relationships between wives of foreign officials and local soup producers had evolved into sophisticated trade networks that connected underground economies across the entire Eastern Bloc, creating economic integration that socialist governments claimed to want but somehow never achieved through official channels. Irina had stumbled into international commerce when she delivered premium borscht to a Hungarian cultural attaché's wife who couldn't obtain decent vegetables through official embassy channels. The Hungarian woman had access to spices and ingredients that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, creating immediate opportunities for mutually beneficial exchange. Within months, Irina was coordinating with participants in Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, and East Berlin, creating supply chains that made official Comecon trade look amateur by comparison. You observe the diplomatic dinner party that functions as a cover for international business negotiations. Conversations about family recipes and cooking traditions actually negotiate pricing structures and delivery schedules for cross-border ingredient smuggling. Discussions about cultural preservation and traditional foods establish quality standards and territorial agreements between different national networks. The wives of socialist diplomats had created their own version of international commerce that worked better than their husbands' official economic cooperation agreement. The beauty of using diplomatic channels was that embassy personnel had regular travel privileges and diplomatic immunity that made border crossings routine rather than suspicious. A Polish diplomat's wife could transport Hungarian paprika to Moscow with less scrutiny than an ordinary citizen faced buying vegetables at local markets. Cultural exchanges became cover for commercial activities that connected customers with suppliers across international boundaries that were supposed to prevent such relationships. Historians still argue whether diplomatic families' participation in underground economies constituted corruption or simple adaptation to inadequate official supply systems, but the results suggest these networks provided services that official diplomatic institutions couldn't match. Embassy commissaries were supposed to provide foreign officials with familiar foods from their home countries, but they rarely delivered acceptable quality or variety. The housewife networks succeeded where government programs failed. The international coordination required communication protocols that exploited official diplomatic channels while avoiding detection by security services that monitored both domestic underground activities and foreign intelligence operations. Irina had learned to embed commercial messages within cultural exchange correspondence, using discussions about traditional recipes and cooking techniques to coordinate complex international business transactions. You watch the quality control process that ensures Hungarian paprika meets Moscow standards while Polish sausage satisfies Prague customers. The international networks had developed testing protocols that would impress modern global food companies, ensuring that products maintained consistent quality across borders and cultural preferences. They'd created brand standards that customers could trust regardless of which country their soup ingredients originated from. The financial mechanisms were equally sophisticated, creating currency exchange systems that operated independently of official banking relationships between socialist countries. Ingredients moved in one direction while payments flowed in another, often through third countries and multiple intermediaries who could provide plausible explanations for financial transactions that appeared completely unrelated to food commerce. But the most remarkable development was how the international networks had created their own forms of cultural diplomacy that improved relationships between countries whose official interactions were often strained by political disagreements. Polish women were learning about Russian cooking preferences, Hungarian suppliers were adapting their products for Estonian customers, and Czech intermediaries were developing expertise in cross-cultural customer service that connected diverse markets with appropriate products. The networks had essentially created their own version of European integration decades before official political integration became possible. They'd proved that ordinary citizens could build economic relationships across national boundaries when governments failed to provide adequate frameworks for cooperation. Cultural exchange through food commerce was achieving regional cooperation that diplomatic negotiations couldn't accomplish. By 1981, the international Borscht networks were handling more cross-border food trade than many official commercial relationships between socialist countries. They'd created distribution systems that delivered better products more efficiently than state trading organizations, while building social relationships that improved understanding between different national cultures. You follow Irina as she coordinates a complex multi-country transaction involving ingredients from 5 different socialist republics and 3 different countries, all delivered to customers in Moscow who are planning an international dinner party for foreign officials who don't realize they're consuming the products of underground economic cooperation. The irony is delicious, literally and figuratively. The international operations had also created new security challenges, as multiple countries' intelligence services were potentially monitoring activities that crossed their jurisdictions. The women had to develop operational protocols that avoided detection by Soviet, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, and East German security agencies simultaneously, while maintaining business relationships that required regular communication and coordination. But success had attracted attention from authorities who were beginning to realize that citizens were building international economic relationships that bypassed official control and demonstrated alternatives to centralized socialist economic planning. The networks had proved that free trade could work between socialist countries when bureaucratic obstacles were eliminated and customer satisfaction became the primary objective. The revolution had gone international, creating economic diplomacy that worked better than official diplomacy while building relationships that would outlast the political systems that tried to prevent them. The Housewives had accidentally created the foundations for post-socialist European integration, one bowl of soup at a time. The borders had become porous to good food and entrepreneurial cooperation, and the women were about to discover whether their international success would attract the wrong kind of diplomatic attention from governments that weren't ready for citizen-driven globalization. You're about to witness the golden age of underground soup capitalism, when some Soviet housewives were earning more from their kitchen operations than nuclear engineers made from splitting atoms, and the gap between official poverty and unofficial prosperity had become so wide you could drive a Lada through it, if you could afford a Lada, which ironically the soup entrepreneurs could. It's 1982, and you're sitting in Raisa Dmitrievna's newly renovated apartment, surrounded by furnishings that would make party officials jealous, watching her count evening profits that exceed most citizens' monthly salaries, while she explains how borscht became more lucrative than rocket science. The economic boom hadn't happened overnight. It was the culmination of 15 years of network development, market expansion, and operational refinement that had transformed amateur cooking circles into sophisticated business enterprises capable of generating wealth that rivaled official Soviet success stories. Raisa's operation alone was producing over 800 liters of premium soup weekly, serving a customer base that included government officials, factory directors, successful black market operators, and foreign diplomats who paid prices that reflected the true value of quality food in a scarcity economy. You observe the morning planning session that resembles a corporate board meeting more than traditional housewife activities. Raisa reviews production schedules, inventory levels, customer orders, and financial projections with assistants who understand that they're participating in the most successful small business in their neighborhood. The operation employs 12 women in various capacities, from procurement specialists who manage ingredient sourcing to customer service representatives who handle delivery and payment collection. The profit margins were staggering by any economic standard. Premium borscht that cost approximately 8 rubles to produce sold for 30 to 40 rubles, generating returns that would impress venture capitalists in market economies. But the real profits came from volume and customer loyalty. Raisa's established customers ordered consistently, paid reliably, and recommended her services to friends who were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed quality. The wealth accumulation was becoming impossible to hide, despite elaborate efforts to disguise prosperity as something other than commercial success. Raisa's apartment featured imported furniture that officially didn't exist in Soviet stores, electronic equipment that required special connections to obtain, and clothing that indicated access to luxury goods unavailable to ordinary citizens. She was living better than most party officials while officially being unemployed. Historians still argue whether the underground economies of the late Soviet period actually provided higher living standards than official employment, but Raisa's lifestyle offered definitive answers. She could afford luxuries that her engineer husband's official salary couldn't purchase, provide educational opportunities for her children that exceeded what state institutions offered, and maintain social connections that included some of the most influential people in her city. The success had created new challenges around wealth management that tested the network's ability to handle prosperity without attracting dangerous attention. Raisa had learned to spread her assets across multiple investments that appeared unrelated to food commerce. Real estate purchases disguised as family inheritance, luxury goods acquired through barter transactions that left no paper trails, and financial reserves distributed among trusted associates who could provide access without revealing sources. You watch the sophisticated customer segmentation that maximizes revenue from different market segments. Working-class customers receive excellent soup at competitive prices that build volume and reputation. Middle-class professionals pay premium rates for convenience and consistency that saves them time and effort. Wealthy customers access ultra-premium products and services that justify extraordinary pricing through exclusivity and personalized attention. The network expansion had created franchise opportunities that allowed successful operators to share techniques and customer bases with new participants while maintaining quality standards and territorial agreements. Raisa had trained women in 3 other cities to replicate her methods, receiving percentage payments from their operations while helping them avoid mistakes that could damage the broader network's reputation. But the most remarkable aspect was how the women had created their own version of corporate culture that motivated participants to achieve excellence while maintaining operational security. Network members took pride in product quality, customer satisfaction, and financial success that went far beyond simple profit motivation. They developed professional identities as entrepreneurs and business leaders that official Soviet society claimed didn't exist. The economic success had also created opportunities for reinvestment that improved operations and expanded capabilities. Raisa had purchased professional-grade cooking equipment through black market channels, improved her storage and preservation facilities, and developed transportation systems that enhanced delivery efficiency and customer service. Profits were funding infrastructure improvements that increased competitive advantages and operational capacity. By 1983, some soup operations were generating annual revenues that exceeded what small state enterprises produced, while providing customer satisfaction levels that official businesses rarely achieved. The women had proved that private enterprise could create value, generate employment, and serve customer needs more effectively than socialist economic planning, even when operating under legal and political constraints that would destroy most legitimate businesses. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore. Women who were officially unemployed were creating more economic value than many citizens who held prestigious official positions. Housewives were demonstrating entrepreneurial capabilities that exceeded what business schools taught, because business schools didn't exist in the Soviet Union and wouldn't have taught the practical skills these women had learned through necessity and experience. You observe the lifestyle that underground success had created. Raisa's children attended the best schools money could access. Her family vacationed at resorts that required special connections to visit, and her social circle included people whose official positions were enhanced by unofficial prosperity. She was living proof that Soviet citizens could achieve abundance when freed from the constraints that limited official economic activity. But success had also created vulnerabilities that tested whether prosperity could survive the scrutiny it inevitably attracted. The gap between official poverty and unofficial wealth was becoming so obvious that even sympathetic observers were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about where exactly all this money was coming from. The revolution had achieved its economic objectives, proving that citizens could create prosperity through voluntary cooperation and market mechanisms. But success raised new questions about whether underground capitalism could coexist with official socialism, or whether prosperity would ultimately force choices between hidden wealth and open freedom. The women had built empires in their kitchens, but empires attract attention from people who believe they should be building empires instead. You're about to witness the most heartwarming and heartbreaking educational system never officially acknowledged, as mothers teach daughters skills that would serve them better than any Soviet university while simultaneously preparing them for a world that didn't yet exist but they somehow knew was coming. It's 1984, and you're watching 16-year-old Katia Volkonsky learn her family's secret curriculum alongside her traditional schoolwork, mastering customer relations, inventory management, and quality control while her teachers assume she's just helping babushka with cooking, completely unaware that she's receiving business education superior to anything Harvard would offer for another decade. The generational transfer of knowledge wasn't just about preserving recipes. It was about transmitting entrepreneurial skills, business acumen, and survival strategies that had been refined through 20 years of underground operations. The women understood that their daughters would inherit a different world, though they couldn't predict exactly what that world would look like. What they knew was that skills in customer service, financial management, and creative problem-solving would be valuable regardless of political system. Katia's education began with seemingly innocent tasks that concealed sophisticated business training. Helping grandmother with grocery shopping actually taught procurement strategies, supplier evaluation, and cost analysis. Assisting with food preparation provided lessons in quality control, production efficiency, and inventory management. Delivering soup to customers became training in relationship building, customer satisfaction, and service excellence. You observe the delicate balance between protecting innocence and providing preparation. The mothers couldn't fully explain the legal and political risks their activities involved without terrifying their daughters or potentially compromising operational security. Instead, they taught general principles about discretion, trust, and careful judgment that would serve their children well regardless of what specific challenges they eventually faced. The training methods were masterfully disguised as traditional feminine education that wouldn't attract attention from schools or neighbors. Daughters learned mathematical skills through recipe calculations and pricing analysis. They developed organizational abilities through managing customer orders and delivery schedules. Most importantly, they acquired confidence and independence through activities that demonstrated their capability to create value and solve problems. Historians still argue whether Soviet education actually prepared students for economic success or simply trained them for bureaucratic compliance. But these young women were receiving practical education that developed real-world capabilities. They were learning skills that would transfer to any economic system, understanding customer needs, managing resources efficiently, building trust-based relationships, and adapting to changing conditions. The mother-daughter teaching sessions looked like traditional cooking lessons but functioned as comprehensive business seminars. Katia learned to evaluate ingredient quality with standards that exceeded professional food service requirements. She mastered cost accounting techniques that could track profitability across multiple product lines and customer segments. Most remarkably, she developed customer service instincts that prioritized satisfaction and loyalty over short-term profit maximization. You watch the subtle psychology lessons embedded within business training. Katia learns to read customer moods and adjust her approach accordingly, developing emotional intelligence that would serve her in any career. She practices negotiation techniques through seemingly innocent conversations about recipe preferences and delivery schedules. She masters the art of building trust while maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional relationships. The generational transfer also preserved cultural knowledge that official education was systematically eliminating. Traditional cooking techniques, agricultural wisdom, and household management skills that connected families to their pre-revolutionary heritage were being transmitted alongside modern business capabilities. The daughters were learning to bridge past and future, preserving valuable traditions while developing skills for economic systems that didn't yet exist. But the most important lessons were about resilience and adaptation. Through observing their mothers navigate official persecution, supply disruptions, and competitive pressures, the daughters learned that success required flexibility, creativity, and determination that went beyond simple technical competence. They were absorbing life skills that would enable them to thrive under uncertainty and create opportunities when official systems failed to provide them. The education extended beyond individual families into network-wide mentorship programs that connected experienced operators with promising young women. Katia learned from multiple teachers who specialized in different aspects of the business, receiving diverse perspectives and techniques that broadened her capabilities beyond what any single mentor could provide. You observe how the daughters were unconsciously preparing for economic transition that their mothers sensed was inevitable even if they couldn't predict its timing or specific characteristic. The skills being transmitted, entrepreneurship, customer focus, quality management, and adaptability, were exactly what would be needed to succeed in market economies that were beginning to emerge in other socialist countries. By 1985, the second generation was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their mother's achievements while bringing fresh perspectives and innovations that enhanced network operations. The daughters weren't just preserving their inheritance, they were improving it, combining traditional wisdom with youthful creativity to develop new products, better customer service, and more efficient operations. The most touching aspect was watching mothers sacrifice their own recognition to ensure their daughters' futures. These women had built successful enterprises that they could never publicly acknowledge, developed expertise they could never officially credential, and created wealth they could never openly display. But they were determined that their daughters would inherit both the capabilities and, hopefully, the freedom to use them openly. The generational transfer was essentially creating a shadow business school that operated within traditional family structures, teaching practical skills that official education ignored, while preserving cultural knowledge that political ideology was trying to eliminate. The mothers were preparing their daughters for economic freedom that they themselves had never experienced but somehow knew was coming. But teaching entrepreneurial skills to teenagers also meant preparing them for risks and responsibilities that most parents would prefer their children never face. The mothers were passing down both opportunities and burdens, hoping their daughters would inherit the benefits without the dangers that had defined their own experiences. The revolution was preparing its next generation, ensuring that hard-won knowledge and capabilities would survive political transitions while evolving to meet new challenges and opportunities that awaited them in an uncertain but potentially more promising future. You're about to witness the moment when underground capitalism collided with official reform, creating the most delicious irony in Soviet history. Glasnost was supposed to bring transparency, but it actually revealed that the women had been more transparent about economic reality than their government had been for decades. It's 1987, and you're sitting in what was once a secret meeting room but is now an almost legal business planning session, watching Svetlana Mikhailovna navigate the bewildering transition from criminal entrepreneur to legitimate businesswoman, while wondering whether official permission to do what she'd been doing successfully for 20 years might actually make things more complicated, not less. The changes hadn't arrived gradually. They'd crashed over the networks like a tsunami of official recognition that nobody quite knew how to handle. Perestroika was supposed to encourage private enterprise, but the women discovered that legal business required permits, licenses, tax payments, and regulatory compliance that made their previous illegal operations look simple by comparison. They'd been more efficient as criminals than they could be as legitimate entrepreneurs, which suggested uncomfortable truths about Soviet bureaucracy that reform advocates preferred not to discuss. Svetlana's transformation from underground operator to semi-legal business owner required skills that 20 years of successful criminal activity hadn't taught her. You watch her struggle with official paperwork that asks questions about business activities she'd spent decades learning to conceal. How do you explain customer relationships built on trust and discretion to bureaucrats who want documented contracts and recorded transactions? How do you report revenue from operations that succeeded precisely because they left no official records? The legitimization process revealed just how sophisticated the underground networks had become. When authorities began investigating existing private enterprises to understand how legal reforms should be structured, they discovered operations that exceeded official businesses in complexity, efficiency, and customer satisfaction. The women weren't learning to be entrepreneurs, they were teaching the government what entrepreneurship actually looked like when it was allowed to function without bureaucratic interference. You observe the regulatory confusion that emerged when officials tried to classify businesses that didn't fit existing categories. Was premium borscht production a restaurant service, food manufacturing, or agricultural processing? Did customer delivery constitute retail trade or transportation services? Were the quality guarantees and customer loyalty programs that the networks had developed examples of consumer protection or unfair competitive advantages? The bureaucrats were discovering that real business didn't match their theoretical framework. Historians still argue whether glasnost actually encouraged private enterprise or simply made existing underground activities more visible. But these women were living proof that Soviet citizens had been practicing capitalism for decades while their government was still debating whether capitalism was theoretically possible under socialism. The networks had evolved market mechanisms, customer service standards, and competitive strategies that exceeded what reform advocates thought private enterprise could achieve. The semi-legal status created new opportunities and new headaches simultaneously. Svetlana could now advertise her services openly, but advertising attracted competition from operators who had less experience and lower standards. She could expand her operations legally, but expansion required capital investments that illegal businesses had avoided through informal resource sharing. Most confusingly, she could now earn legal profits, but legal profits were subject to taxes and regulations that significantly reduced their actual value. The cultural adjustment was equally challenging. Women who had spent decades maintaining absolute discretion about their business activities now had to learn to promote themselves publicly. Network members who had survived through carefully controlled customer relationships now faced open market competition where reputation and results had to be demonstrated rather than transmitted through trusted intermediaries. You watch the adaptation strategies that emerged as networks tried to preserve their competitive advantages while complying with new legal requirements. Some operations chose full legitimization, accepting regulatory burdens in exchange for growth opportunities and legal protection. Others maintained hybrid approaches that combined legal compliance with unofficial efficiency improvement. A few decided that underground operations remained more profitable than legal alternatives and continued operating as they always had. The most remarkable development was how the women's experience informed official reform policies. Government advisors began consulting with successful underground operators to understand what regulatory frameworks would actually encourage rather than discourage private enterprise. The networks had become informal research laboratories for testing economic theories that reform planners were trying to implement on a national scale. But legitimization also attracted new forms of competition that threatened the customer relationships and quality standards the networks had spent years developing. Official restaurants and food services began trying to replicate the women's success without understanding the customer service culture and quality commitments that had made that success possible. The market was becoming crowded with competitors who offered similar products at lower prices but couldn't match the reliability and personalized attention that customers had learned to expect. By 1988, some networks were earning higher profits as legal businesses than they had achieved through underground operations, but others discovered that official compliance destroyed the operational efficiency and customer intimacy that had been their primary competitive advantages. The transition revealed that success had been based not just on filling market gaps, but on creating business relationships that official Soviet commerce had never understood or valued. The women faced choices between preserving the culture that had made them successful and adapting to legal frameworks that might enable expansion but could compromise the trust and quality standards that had been their foundations. They were discovering that being legal wasn't necessarily better than being effective, and that official approval might be less valuable than customer satisfaction. The revolution was going legitimate, but legitimacy brought new challenges that tested whether underground success could survive the transition to open competition and official recognition. The women who had built empires in the shadows now had to decide whether they wanted to rule in the sunlight or continue profiting in the darkness. The choice would determine not just their individual futures, but the fate of entrepreneurial culture they'd created and preserved through decades of persecution and official indifference. You're about to discover how 25 years of underground soup capitalism laid the foundation for post-Soviet Russia's entire informal economy, proving that sometimes the most important revolutions happen not with manifestos and barricades, but with wooden spoons and mason jars filled with crimson liquid that tasted like freedom itself. It's 1991, and you're standing in what was once Galina Stepanovna's secret kitchen laboratory but is now a legitimate restaurant, watching her train a new generation of entrepreneurs while reflecting on how the women who taught themselves to survive in the cracks of a failing system ended up building the blueprint for economic recovery that nobody had planned but everyone desperately needed. The Soviet Union was collapsing around them, but the Borscht networks barely noticed. They'd been operating their own version of market economics for so long that official political changes felt like bureaucratic adjustments rather than revolutionary transformation. While government officials struggled to understand concepts like customer service, competitive pricing, and quality control, these women had been practicing those principles for decades. They weren't learning capitalism. They were finally allowed to admit they'd been capitalists all along. Galina's story had become the template for transformation that thousands of other women were following across the former Soviet territories. The customer relationships she'd built through underground soup sales became the foundation for a legitimate catering business. The supply networks she'd developed through black market ingredient procurement became official vendor relationships with farmers and distributors. Most importantly, the trust and reputation she'd established through years of reliable service translated directly into competitive advantages that new businesses couldn't match. You observe the mentorship programs that connected experienced underground operators with younger entrepreneurs who wanted to learn from women who'd survived and thrived under impossible conditions. The knowledge transfer wasn't just about business techniques, it was about developing the psychological resilience, creative problem solving, and customer focus that had enabled success when success was illegal and dangerous. The economic impact was staggering and largely uncounted by official statistics that couldn't measure underground activities or their legitimate successors. Economists estimated that informal networks like the Borscht operations had generated hundreds of millions of rubles annually during the Soviet period, employing tens of thousands of people and serving hundreds of thousands of customers who couldn't obtain adequate alternatives through official channels. They'd created economic value that exceeded many official industries while building social relationships that strengthened communities. Historians still argue whether the underground economies of the late Soviet period actually hastened the system's collapse or simply provided alternatives that made collapse more survivable. But these women had clearly chosen survival over ideology. They'd proved that ordinary citizens could create prosperity when political systems provided freedom, even when that freedom had to be stolen rather than granted. The cultural legacy was equally profound. The women had preserved entrepreneurial values and business skills during decades when such attitudes were officially discouraged or criminalized. They'd maintained traditions of quality, service, and customer satisfaction that became competitive advantages when market economies finally emerged. Most importantly, they demonstrated that economic success was possible for people who lacked official credentials or political connections but possessed determination and practical intelligence. You watch the new restaurants, catering services, and food processing businesses that emerged from the networks, each one carrying DNA from the underground operations that had incubated their founders' capabilities. The customer service standards, quality commitments, and operational efficiency that characterized these new enterprises reflected lessons learned through years of succeeding under adverse conditions. But the transition wasn't universally successful. Some network participants discovered that their skills had been specifically adapted to underground conditions and didn't transfer easily to legitimate business environment. Others found that official competition and regulatory requirements destroyed the profit margins and operational flexibility that had made their underground activities worthwhile. The women who succeeded were those who could adapt their knowledge to new conditions while preserving the customer focus and quality standards that had been their competitive advantages. The international connections that had developed during the Soviet period became the foundation for legitimate cross-border trade relationships that helped integrate the former Soviet republics into broader European and global markets. Women who had smuggled ingredients across socialist borders became import-export entrepreneurs who understood customer preferences and supply chain logistics better than multinational corporations that were trying to enter these markets. By 1995, many former underground operators were running successful legitimate businesses that employed hundreds of people and served thousands of customers who remembered when such service quality was impossible to obtain through official channels. They'd proved that market economies could emerge from within socialist systems when ordinary citizens were allowed to use their intelligence and initiative to solve practical problems. The most remarkable legacy was how the networks had created social capital and economic relationships that survived political transformation and provided stability during chaotic transition periods. Communities that had been served by underground food networks adapted more successfully to market economies because they'd already learned to function through voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit rather than bureaucratic allocation and political favoritism. You reflect on the broader lessons that emerged from 25 years of underground soup capitalism. The women had demonstrated that economic systems were ultimately about human relationships and practical problem-solving rather than political ideology and theoretical framework. They'd proved that customer satisfaction and quality delivery could overcome almost any obstacle when people were motivated by genuine care for their communities and families. The Borscht Revolution hadn't just changed how people ate, it had changed how they thought about work, success, and economic possibility. It had preserved entrepreneurial culture during periods when such attitudes were dangerous and transmitted practical business skills to generations who would need them when political conditions finally allowed open enterprise. But perhaps most importantly, it had proved that ordinary people could create extraordinary results when they were free to use their capabilities in service of goals they chose for themselves. The women hadn't just survived the Soviet system, they'd built alternatives that worked better than the official institutions that were supposed to serve them. The revolution that began with frustration over empty store shelves had ended with proof that citizens could create abundance when they were allowed to cooperate voluntarily and compete openly. The soup was just the beginning. The real recipe was for economic freedom itself. As the last traces of communism disappeared into history, the aroma of properly made borscht lingered as evidence that human ingenuity and determination could flourish under any circumstances, creating value and building communities that no political system could destroy or replace. The women had written their own economic history with wooden spoons and serving ladles, and their legacy was a generation of entrepreneurs who understood that success came not from government permission, but from serving customers better than anyone else was willing or able to do. And so our journey through the secret kitchens of Soviet resistance comes to its gentle end, like steam slowly rising from a final pot of borscht cooling in the evening air. These women didn't set out to change the world. They simply wanted to feed their families properly and earn honest livings in a system that made both goals nearly impossible. Yet their quiet revolution with wooden spoons and mason jars accomplished what decades of political manifestos couldn't. They proved that human creativity and determination could flourish anywhere, even in the shadows of the most oppressive systems ever created. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of those cramped communal kitchens where ordinary grandmothers became extraordinary entrepreneurs, teaching us that the most powerful revolutions often happen not in government palaces or university lecture halls, but in the humble spaces where people gather to solve practical problems with love, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief that life can be better when we're free to make it so. The legacy of the Borscht Revolution lives on in every small business that prioritizes customer satisfaction over profit, every entrepreneur who chooses quality over quantity, and every person who believes that ordinary citizens can create extraordinary change when they're allowed to follow their dreams and serve their communities. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere tonight, someone is stirring a pot of soup with the same spirit of hope and determination that once turned Soviet kitchens into temples of economic freedom. Sweet dreams, and may your own revolutions be as satisfying as a perfect bowl of borscht shared with people you love.